Hello and thank you for joining for today's dark and scary cryptid horror stories. The first story today is called The Sweetness of the Scar. This is a cryptid horror story about the Kuchisake, a famous Japanese urban legend and vengeful spirit described as a tall woman with long black hair, pale skin, and a face partially hidden by a surgical mask. Beneath the mask, her mouth is gruesomely slit from ear to ear. In this story, a modern, suffocatingly dense Japanese suburb, a cynical sociology student researching collective delusions. He treats the Kuchisake sightings as a viral trend, mass hysteria fueled by social media. He mocks the survival guides circulating online, the candy, the ambiguous answers as placebos for the anxious. The second story today is called The Canopy's Weight. This is a cryptid horror story about the Sliver Cat, a legendary North American fearsome critter from lumberjack folklore. It is described as a large, 300-pound arboreal feline with tasseled ears, red horizontally-slit eyes, and a massive 11-foot tail ending in a bony, two-sided club. In this story, a group of 8 am-a-teur naturalists and crypto-zoology enthusiasts venture into a remote, ancient stretch of the Appalachian wilderness. They aren't looking for a myth, they are looking for a discovery to catapult them to fame. A man obsessed with the journals of 18th-century frontiersmen. He dismisses the Sliver Cat as a folk tale, a fearsome critter born of whiskey and isolation, while simultaneously leading the group deeper into the same high-canopy territory where the creatures thrive. In the description below, the stories have been time-stamped. Now for today's cryptid horror stories, I hope you all enjoy. The Sweetness of the Scar. The peppermint-flavored hard candy dissolved on his tongue with a slow, deliberate sweetness that seemed to last forever, each granule releasing its burst of cool, mentholated flavor in waves that traveled from his mouth down his throat and into his stomach with a warmth that was almost sensual. Kenji had always loved peppermint candies, ever since he was a child, when his grandmother would slip them into his pocket before he left for school, their crinkling wrappers a promise of comfort in a world that had seemed, even then, too large and too cruel. He sucked on the candy now, standing in the dimly lit residential alley that connected his apartment building to the main road, and he thought about his grandmother, about her wrinkled hands and her gentle smile, about the way she had smelled of incense and old fabric. He thought about how she had died 3 years ago, quietly in her sleep, her face peaceful in a way that it had never been in life. And he thought about how much he missed her, how much he wished she were here now, to slip another candy into his pocket and tell him that everything would be all right. But everything was not all right. Kenji knew that, had known it for weeks, perhaps months, though he had refused to acknowledge it, wrapping himself in the armor of cynicism and academic detachment that he had spent years forging. He was a sociology student at Tokyo University, a bright, promising young man of 23 who had devoted his academic career to the study of collective delusions, the ways in which groups of people could convince themselves of things that were not real, could see patterns in chaos and meaning in randomness. He had written papers on mass hysteria, on urban legends, on the psychology of crowds, and he had always approached his subjects with a cool, analytical distance that his professors praised and his peers envied. He did not believe in ghosts or monsters or things that went bump in the night. He believed in sociology, in statistics, in the power of rational explanation to illuminate even the darkest corners of human experience. And that was why, when the rumors about the Kuchisake began to circulate through the dense, suffocating suburbs of Tokyo, Kenji had treated them with the same amused contempt he reserved for all urban legends. The Kuchisake, the slit-mouthed woman, was a figure of Japanese folklore, a vengeful spirit said to wander the streets wearing a surgical mask and carrying a sharp object, usually a pair of scissors or a knife. She would approach her victims, usually children or young men, and ask, "Watashi kairi, am I beautiful?" If the victim answered yes, she would remove her mask to reveal a mouth that had been slit from ear to ear, a grotesque wound that stretched beyond the natural limits of a human jaw, and she would ask, "Cori demo," even now. If the victim answered no or screamed or tried to run, she would kill them. If they answered yes, she would mark them, slit their mouths to match hers, and let them live as a warning to others. The legend was old, dating back to the Edo period, and it had resurfaced periodically throughout Japanese history, usually during times of social stress or economic hardship. The current outbreak of sightings, which had begun 3 months ago in the suburbs of western Tokyo, was no different, Kenji had told himself. It was a manifestation of collective anxiety, a viral meme spread by social media and amplified by the echo chambers of internet forums. The survival guides that circulated online, the advice to carry candy, to give ambiguous answers, to throw money or fruit to distract the spirit, were nothing more than placebos for the anxious, rituals of control in a world that felt increasingly out of control. Kenji had mocked these guides in his blog posts, his academic papers, his conversations with friends. He had laughed at the people who claimed to have seen her, dismissing them as attention seekers, hysterics, or victims of suggestion. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his rationalism, so secure in his disbelief. And then he had seen her. It had happened 3 nights ago, though it felt like 3 lifetimes. Kenji had been walking home from the university library, his backpack heavy with books on sociological theory, his mind preoccupied with an upcoming presentation on mass hysteria in post-war Japan. The alley he took was a shortcut, a narrow passage between 2 blocks of apartment buildings that saved him 5 minutes on his walk, but plunged him into a darkness that was almost absolute, broken only by the occasional security light that flickered and buzzed overhead. He had walked this alley 100 times before, maybe 1,000, and he had never felt anything but the mild discomfort of any urban dweller in a poorly lit space. But that night had been different. The air had been still, unnaturally so, as if the city itself had held its breath. The sounds of traffic from the nearby main road had been muffled, distant, as if he were walking through a tunnel or underwater. And there had been a smell, faint but unmistakable, a sweet, cloying scent that reminded him of funeral flowers and old perfume. He had seen her standing at the end of the alley, a figure silhouetted against the light of a distant street lamp. She was wearing a trench coat, the kind that had been fashionable decades ago, belted at the waist and hanging to her knees. Her hair was long and dark, falling straight to her waist, and her face was hidden by a white surgical mask that caught the light and seemed to glow with an inner luminescence. Kenji had stopped, his hand instinctively reaching for the peppermint candy in his pocket, and he had felt the first stirrings of unease. He had told himself that it was just a woman, a local resident walking home late, perhaps a nurse or a dentist, someone who wore masks as a matter of professional habit. He had told himself that the unease was a product of his own suggestibility, his own immersion in the legends he studied. He had told himself to keep walking, to pass her without a second glance, to prove to himself that he was not susceptible to the same mass hysteria he so readily dismissed. And then she had spoken. "Watashi kairi." The voice was soft, almost whispered, but it carried with a clarity that was unnatural, piercing the silence of the alley like a needle through cloth. It was a woman's voice, high and melodic, but there was something wrong with it, something that Kenji could not quite name. It was too sweet, too controlled, as if every syllable had been rehearsed and calibrated for maximum effect. Kenji had frozen, his feet rooted to the spot, his mind racing. He knew the question. Everyone in Tokyo knew the question. And he knew with a certainty that went beyond reason that the woman before him was not a nurse or a dentist or a local resident. She was the Kuchisake, and she was asking him the question. He had considered his options with a speed that surprised him. He could run, but the alley was narrow and she was blocking the exit. He could scream, but the buildings around him were silent, their windows dark, and help was unlikely to arrive in time. He could refuse to answer, but the legend said that non-responses were treated the same as negative responses, and he did not want to find out what the scissors felt like against his throat. And so, driven by a desperate instinct that was part courage and part fatalism, he had answered. "Yes," he had said, his voice cracking slightly. "Yes, you are beautiful." The woman had tilted her head, a gesture that was almost bird-like in its curiosity, and she had reached up with one hand to touch the edge of her mask. Kenji had watched, paralyzed, as her fingers found the loop of elastic behind her ear and pulled. The mask came away slowly, almost reluctantly, and the face beneath was revealed in the dim light of the distant street lamp. Kenji had seen many things in his 23 years. He had seen the aftermath of traffic accidents, the mangled bodies and spilled brains that were part of urban life. He had seen videos of war and famine and disease, images of suffering that had been designed to shock and disturb. He had thought himself inured to horror, armored against the grotesque by the very cynicism that was now his greatest weakness. But nothing in his entire life had prepared him for the sight of the Kuchisake-kana's face. The mouth was not merely slit. It was not a wound, not a scar, not a disfigurement that could be explained by accident or surgery. It was a maw, a gaping chasm that stretched from ear to ear, the lips peeled back to reveal raw, wet tissue that glistened in the faint light like the inside of a fresh wound. The jaw hung loose, unhinged like that of a snake, and from the depths of the maw protruded rows of teeth that were not human, not anymore. They were too numerous, too sharp, too perfectly arranged in concentric circles that spiraled down into a darkness that seemed to have no bottom. And the smell that emanated from that impossible mouth, was the smell of rotting meat and old blood and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded Kenji of the peppermint candy dissolving on his tongue, but wrong, corrupted, twisted into something that was the opposite of sweetness. "Kori demo?" she had asked, her voice still soft, still melodic, but now underlaid with a wet, gurgling quality that suggested the movement of fluids in places where fluids should not be. Even now, Kenji's mind had gone blank, wiped clean of thought and reason by the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing. He had stood there, his mouth open, his eyes wide, his body frozen in a terror that was so complete it had transcended the physical and become something almost spiritual, a confrontation with the absolute that left no room for doubt or disbelief. And then in the blankness, a memory had surfaced, a fragment of information that he had absorbed during his research and dismissed as nonsense. The candy. The legend said that if you offered the Kuchisake-kana candy, she would be momentarily confused, her spectral logic disrupted by the presence of something sweet, something that reminded her of her mortal life, of the woman she had been before the curse. Kenji did not have candy. He had eaten his last peppermint hours ago, but he had something else. His hand, moving with a will of its own, had reached into his pocket and closed around a handful of loose coins, the change from his dinner at the university cafeteria, a few hundred yen in silver and copper. He had pulled them out, his fingers trembling, and he had flung them at the creature's feet. The coins had scattered across the pavement with a sound like rain on stone, a glittering, chiming cascade that seemed impossibly loud in the silence of the alley. The Kuchisake-kana had looked down, her head tilting again in that bird-like gesture, and her eyes, which had been fixed upon Kenji with an intensity that was almost physical, had followed the movement of the coins. She had paused, her maw still gaping, her body still as a statue, and in that pause Kenji had found the strength to move. He had turned and run, his feet pounding against the pavement, his backpack bouncing against his spine, his lungs burning with the effort of flight. He had not looked back. He had not dared. He had run until he reached the main road, the familiar sight of traffic and streetlights and other human beings, and he had collapsed against a lamppost, gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs, his vision swimming with the afterimages of that impossible face. He had stayed there for an hour, maybe longer, too frightened to move, too shaken to speak, until a police patrol had found him and asked if he was all right. He had mumbled something about feeling faint, about the stress of exams, and they had let him go with a sympathetic pat on the shoulder and advice to get more sleep. He had walked the rest of the way home in a daze, his mind replaying the encounter over and over, searching for explanations, for rationalizations, for any framework that could accommodate what he had seen. There was none. The Kuchisake was real. She was here in the suburbs of Tokyo, in the alleys and the shadows and the spaces between streetlights, and she had asked him the question, and he had survived. But survival, Kenji was beginning to realize, was not the same as safety. As the peppermint candy finally dissolved completely, leaving only a cool, residual sweetness on his tongue, Kenji became aware of a sound that had been present for some time but that his fear-frozen mind had filtered out. It was a metallic sound, a rhythmic, deliberate snip-snip-snip that seemed to come from somewhere very close, somewhere just around the corner of the alley. It was the sound of scissors, large scissors, the kind used by tailors or butchers, their blades opening and closing with a smooth, well-oiled precision. Kenji's blood ran cold and the residual sweetness on his tongue turned to ash. He had thrown the coins 3 nights ago. He had escaped, or thought he had escaped. But the sound of the scissors told him that he had been wrong. The pause had not been a reprieve. It had been a delay, and now she was here in the alley waiting for him. He turned slowly, his body moving with the stiff reluctance of a man in a nightmare, and he saw her. She was standing at the entrance to the alley, her trench coat hanging loose around her thin frame, her long dark hair falling across her shoulders like a veil. The surgical mask was back in place, white and pristine and utterly terrifying in its banality. But in her right hand, held down at her side like a conductor's baton, was the scissors. They were large, 12 inches at least, with heavy, gleaming blades that caught the dim light and reflected it back in flashes that seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched Kenji's heartbeat. She stood there motionless, and though her face was hidden by the mask, Kenji could feel her eyes upon him, could sense the weight of her gaze like a physical pressure against his skin. "Watashi, Kairi?" she asked again, her voice carrying down the alley with that same unnatural clarity, that same rehearsed sweetness. And Kenji, his mind blank with terror, his body frozen, could only stare, the peppermint taste turning bitter in his mouth, the memory of his grandmother's gentle hands giving him candy now twisted into something grotesque and cruel. The scissors snapped shut with a sound like a bone breaking, and the woman stepped forward into the alley, and the darkness seemed to deepen around her, to cling to her like a shroud, and Kenji knew, with the absolute certainty of a man facing his own death, that he had made a terrible mistake. The coins had not saved him. Nothing could save him. The only question was how much he would suffer before the end. He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around nothing but lint and air, and he realized with a sinking heart that he had no more candy, no more coins, no more distractions to offer the creature that was walking toward him with a slow, deliberate stride that spoke of infinite patience and infinite hunger. The Kuchisake was not a myth. She was not a delusion. She was real, and she was here, and she was going to kill him. And the last thing he would taste before he died would not be peppermint but blood. But Kenji did not die that night. As the Kuchisake advanced upon him, her scissors rising in a graceful arc that seemed to slow time itself, a sound intruded upon the scene that was so ordinary, so prosaic, that it seemed to belong to a different universe entirely. It was the sound of a car horn, followed by the screech of tires and the shattering of glass. A delivery truck, lost and confused, had turned into the alley by mistake, its headlights flooding the narrow passage with a brilliance that was almost blinding. The Kuchisake paused, her head turning toward the light, her body tensing like a cat's, and in that moment of distraction, Kenji found the strength to move. He ducked beneath her upraised arm and sprinted toward the truck, waving his arms, screaming for help in a voice that was barely human. The driver, a middle-aged man with a cigarette dangling from his lips, stared at him with a mixture of confusion and annoyance. But he stopped the truck, and Kenji threw himself against the passenger door, pounding on the glass with fists that were shaking so badly they could barely make a sound. "Let me in," he screamed. "Please, for the love of God, let me in." The driver, spooked by Kenji's desperation, leaned over and unlocked the door, and Kenji tumbled into the cab, slamming the door behind him and locking it with trembling fingers. "Drive," he gasped. "Please, just drive. Don't look back. Just drive." The driver, a practical man who had seen many strange things in his years of making late-night deliveries, did not argue. He put the truck in gear and accelerated down the alley, the headlights illuminating the figure in the trench coat for just a moment before she was swallowed by the darkness. Kenji looked back, his face pressed against the rear window, and he saw her standing in the middle of the alley, her scissors hanging at her side, her head tilted in that bird-like gesture of curiosity. She did not follow. She simply stood there, watching the truck disappear into the night, and Kenji had the distinct impression that she was smiling beneath her mask, a smile that was not of amusement but of recognition, as if she were acknowledging a game that had only just begun. The driver dropped Kenji at the nearest police station, muttering about crazy college students and the dangers of drugs, and Kenji stumbled inside, his face pale, his clothes soaked with sweat, his mind a whirl of terror and disbelief. The duty officer, a young man who looked barely older than Kenji himself, listened to his story with a growing expression of concern that was not quite belief but not quite dismissal either. "The slit-mouthed woman," the officer said, his voice carefully neutral. That's an old story, son. Are you sure you didn't just see someone in a costume? Maybe a prank?" Kenji wanted to scream, to grab the officer by his uniform and shake him until he understood, until he believed. But he could see the skepticism in the man's eyes, the same skepticism that Kenji himself had worn like a badge of honor for years, and he knew that no amount of words would convince him. "Just file a report," Kenji said, his voice hollow. "Please, in case something happens to me, you'll have it on record." The officer nodded, his expression softening into something that might have been pity, and he took down Kenji's statement with a thoroughness that suggested he was humoring a disturbed young man rather than investigating a crime. When he finished, he gave Kenji a cup of tea and advised him to go home and get some rest, to stop reading scary stories on the internet, to focus on his studies. Kenji thanked him, knowing that the thanks were a lie, and left the station into the cold pre-dawn air. He did not go home. He could not. The alley was between him and his apartment, and he knew, with a certainty that was beyond doubt, that she was waiting for him there, or somewhere near there, somewhere in the shadows that he would have to pass through to reach his bed. Instead, he walked to the university, to the sociology department, where he had a small desk in the graduate student office that he could use to sleep. He let himself in with his key card, nodding to the night security guard who recognized him from his many late nights, and he collapsed onto the narrow cot that he kept in the corner for all-nighters. But sleep did not come. It hovered at the edges of his consciousness, a dark pool that he dared not enter, afraid of what might be waiting for him in his dreams. He lay there staring at the ceiling, his body exhausted but his mind racing, replaying the encounter over and over, searching for details that he might have missed, clues that might explain what was happening to him. And as the dawn began to lighten the sky outside the window, he made a decision. He would not be a victim. He was a scholar, a researcher, a man of reason and intellect. If the Kuchisake was real, then she was a phenomenon that could be studied, analyzed, understood. And if she could be understood, perhaps she could be defeated. He sat up, his eyes red and his body aching, and he opened his laptop. The screen glowed in the darkness of the office, a rectangle of light that seemed to offer a connection to the rational world, the world of facts and data and peer-reviewed studies. He navigated to the internet forums where the Kuchisake sightings were being discussed, the same forums he had once mocked and dismissed, and he began to read. What he found there changed everything. The forum was called Urban Shadows. a subreddit dedicated to Japanese urban legends and paranormal phenomena. Kenji had visited it before, back when he was writing his paper on mass hysteria, and he had found it filled with the usual mix of credulous believers, skeptical debunkers, and trolls who posted fake stories for entertainment. But now, reading with the eyes of a man who had seen the impossible, he detected a different tone in the posts, a seriousness and a fear that could not be faked. There were dozens of threads about the Kuchisake, each one documenting sightings and encounters in the suburbs of western Tokyo. The stories followed a pattern that was chilling in its consistency. The victims were usually young, male or female, walking alone at night in poorly lit areas. They reported seeing a woman in a trench coat and surgical mask who asked them the question. Those who answered yes, and then yes again, were found dead, their faces slashed from ear to ear, their mouths transformed into grotesque mirrors of the creature's own maw. Those who answered no were also found dead, though their deaths were usually more violent, more prolonged, as if the creature took particular offense at the insult. And those who tried to escape, to distract her with candy or coins or ambiguous answers, were marked. They were not killed immediately. They were stalked. The forum was filled with posts from people who called themselves survivors, people who had encountered the Kuchisake and lived to tell about it. They posted under pseudonyms, their identities hidden, and they described a life of constant fear, of looking over their shoulders, of seeing her in every shadow, every reflection, every darkened window. "She follows me," one post read from a user named Shadow Walker 92. "Every night I see her standing at the end of my street. She doesn't move. She just stands there watching. Sometimes she holds the scissors. Sometimes she just stands there with her hands at her sides, but she's always there. Always." Another post from Tokyo Ghost Hunter described a more active pursuit. "I threw a bag of candy at her and ran. I thought I was safe. But the next night she was in my apartment building standing at the end of the hallway. I could hear the scissors snipping. I moved out the next day, changed my address, changed my phone number. But she found me. She always finds me. Last week I saw her in the reflection of a shop window, standing behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. When I looked back at the window, she was gone, but I could still hear the scissors." Kenji read these posts with a growing sense of dread that was mixed, strangely, with a kind of relief. He was not alone. There were others who had seen what he had seen, who had survived the encounter and were now living with the consequences. And if there were others, then there might be answers, strategies, ways to survive that went beyond the childish tricks of candy and coins. He spent hours scrolling through the threads, cataloging the information, cross-referencing the accounts, looking for patterns that might reveal a weakness, a vulnerability, a way to break the curse. What he found was disturbing in its implications. The Kuchisake, according to the forum's collective wisdom, was not a simple ghost or vengeful spirit. She was something more complex, more ancient, a manifestation of a cultural archetype that had taken on a life of its own. The legend said that she had been a beautiful woman in life, the wife or mistress of a samurai, who had been unfaithful and had her mouth slit as punishment for her betrayal. She had died of her wounds, or perhaps she had killed herself, and her spirit had returned to seek vengeance on the living, to punish them for the beauty she had lost. But the forum posts suggested a different interpretation. They suggested that the Kuchisake was not a single spirit but a role, a mask that could be worn by anyone who died with sufficient rage and sufficient vanity. The slit mouth was not a wound but a transformation, a doorway that opened onto something beyond human comprehension. And the scissors were not a weapon but a symbol, a representation of the cutting that had created her, the severing of beauty from truth, of appearance from reality. "She is the gap," one post theorized, from a user who claimed to be a professor of folklore at a prestigious university. "She represents the space between what we see and what is real, between the mask we wear and the face beneath. She asks if she is beautiful because she knows she is not, because the question is a trap that reveals the lie at the heart of all social interaction. When we say yes, we are lying. When we say no, we are condemned. There is no right answer because the question itself is wrong. Kenji read this with a sense of growing understanding that was almost painful in its intensity. He had spent his academic career studying the ways in which people deceived themselves, the collective delusions that allowed societies to function despite the inherent chaos of existence. And now he was face to face with the embodiment of that deception, the physical manifestation of the lie that underpinned all human interaction. The Kuchisake was not an anomaly. She was a revelation. She was the truth that lurked beneath the surface of every smile, every compliment, every social ritual that required people to pretend that things were other than they were. And she was hunting him because he had lied to her, because he had said yes when the only honest answer was no. He closed the laptop, his mind reeling, and he sat in the darkness of the office, watching the dawn light creep across the floor. He needed to find the other survivors, to meet them in person, to pool their knowledge and their resources. He needed to understand the pattern of her movements, the rules of her hunt, the limits of her power. And most of all, he needed to find a way to stop her, to end the stalking, to reclaim his life from the shadow that had fallen across it. He opened the laptop again and composed a post of his own, using a pseudonym that he had never used before, a name that felt like a confession. "I saw her 3 nights ago," he wrote. "In the alley behind my apartment. I threw coins and ran. I thought I was safe, but she's still here. I can feel her watching me. I need to talk to someone who understands. I need help." He posted it and waited, refreshing the page every few minutes, his heart hammering with a mixture of hope and fear. The responses came quickly, faster than he had expected. Most were from the usual crowd of trolls and skeptics, mocking him for his gullibility, offering sarcastic advice, questioning his sanity. But among the noise, there were 3 messages that stood out, that seemed to come from a place of genuine understanding and shared experience. The first was from Office Hana Tokyo, a woman who claimed to work in a nearby office building and who had encountered the Kuchisake 2 weeks prior. "I gave her a hard candy," she wrote. "A peppermint, like the legends say. She took it and she paused and I ran. But she's still following me. I see her in the reflection of the train windows in the glass doors of my office building. I can't sleep. I can't eat. I need to talk to someone too." The second was from Sato Rebel 17, a teenager who claimed to have outsmarted the spirit with a confusing answer. "I told her she was so-so," he wrote. "She seemed confused, like she didn't know what to do. I ran while she was thinking about it, but she came back. She's been in my neighborhood every night since then. My friends don't believe me. My parents think I'm on drugs. I'm scared, man. Really scared." Kenji read these messages with a sense of kinship that was almost overwhelming. Here were people who had seen what he had seen, who had felt what he was feeling, who understood the terror of being hunted by something that should not exist. He replied to both of them, suggesting a meeting, a face-to-face conversation where they could share their stories and plan their next steps. They agreed, tentatively, cautiously, and they arranged to meet at a coffee shop in a busy district, a place that was well lit and crowded, a place where the shadows were banished by fluorescent lights and the presence of other people. Kenji arrived an hour early, his nerves frayed, his eyes darting to every corner of the room. He ordered a coffee that he did not drink, sitting at a table near the window where he could watch the street outside. He had brought a bag of peppermint candies, not because he believed they would save him, but because they had become a kind of talisman, a reminder of the life he had lived before the encounter, the life of safety and rationality and sweet, simple pleasures. The first to arrive was Hana, a woman in her mid-20s with a plain, tired face and hands that trembled as she gripped her coffee cup. She introduced herself with a nod, her eyes scanning the room with a hypervigilance that Kenji recognized from his own behavior. "You don't look like a crazy person," she said, her voice flat and exhausted. "That's good. The last person I tried to talk to about this suggested I see a psychiatrist. I am a crazy person, Kenji replied, managing a weak smile. I spent 3 years studying mass hysteria and now I'm living it. If that's not crazy, I don't know what is. Hana's expression softened slightly, a hint of humor in her eyes that was quickly extinguished by fear. Tell me what happened to you. Every detail, Kenji told her. He described the alley, the smell, the figure in the trench coat, the question, the reveal. He described the maw, the teeth, the smell of rotting meat and old blood. He described the coins, the truck, the escape. And he described the feeling that had not left him since, the sense of being watched, of being hunted, of being marked for a death that was inevitable but delayed. Hana listened without interrupting, her face a mask of concentration, and when he finished, she nodded slowly. I saw almost the same thing, she said. The alley was different, the time of night was different, but the experience was identical. The question, the mask, the mouth, the scissors. It's like she's following a script, a ritual that never changes. Or it's like she's a projection, Kenji said, his academic instincts reasserting themselves despite his fear. A shared hallucination that manifests differently for each observer but follows the same underlying pattern, like a virus replicating itself with minor variations. Hana shook her head. She's not a hallucination, she's real. I know she's real because... She paused, her face paling, and she reached into her purse and pulled out a small object that she placed on the table between them. It was a hard candy, peppermint-flavored, still in its wrapper. But the wrapper was torn and the candy itself was covered in a dark stain that looked like blood. She gave this back to me, Hana whispered. 2 nights ago. I found it on my pillow when I woke up. She had been in my apartment, she had stood over me while I slept, and she had left this as a message. Kenji stared at the candy, his stomach churning. The message was clear, unmistakable. The Kuchisake was not just stalking them. She was playing with them. She was enjoying the game. And the game was about to get much, much worse. Sato arrived at the coffee shop an hour after Hana, his entrance marked by a blast of cold air from the street, and a swagger that seemed deliberately calculated to mask his fear. He was 17, rail-thin, with a shaved head and a collection of piercings that glittered in the fluorescent light like tiny metallic stars. He wore a leather jacket that was too large for his frame, and his eyes, which were a pale, unsettling gray, darted around the room with a nervous energy that suggested he had not slept in days. He spotted Kenji and Hana at their corner table and walked over with a gait that was half strut, half stumble, collapsing into the empty chair with a theatrical sigh that was meant to convey indifference, but only succeeded in revealing his exhaustion. "So you're the other losers," he said, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. "The ones who thought they were smart enough to outsmart a ghost. We survived," Kenji said quietly. "That makes us something, not losers, not winners, just survivors." Sato snorted, but there was no real humor in the sound. "Survivors, right, until she gets bored playing with us. Then we're just dead. Like all the others." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes, tapping one against the table before lighting it with a lighter that bore the logo of a punk rock band. He inhaled deeply, the smoke curling from his nostrils in twin streams, and he fixed Kenji with a stare that was surprisingly direct for someone so young. "You said you wanted to share information. Fine, I'll share. But you better have something useful too, because I'm running out of ideas and I'm running out of places to hide." Hana, who had been silently observing the teenager, leaned forward, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup for warmth. "What happened to you? Tell us everything." Sato took another drag on his cigarette, his eyes glazing over as he stared at some point in the middle distance, and he began to speak. His story was different from Kenji's and Hana's in the details, but identical in its essentials. He had been walking home from a friend's house, cutting through a park that was notorious for being poorly lit, when he had seen her. She had been standing by the swings, her trench coat hanging loose around her thin frame, her surgical mask glowing in the moonlight. She had asked the question, and Sato, who had grown up on stories of the Kuchisake and who had always prided himself on his ability to think on his feet, had given the answer that the legends recommended. So, he had said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. You're so. The woman had paused, her head tilting in that bird-like gesture that Kenji and Hana had both described, and for a moment, Sato had dared to hope that the trick had worked, that the ambiguity of his answer had confused her spectral logic and broken the spell. But then she had reached up and removed her mask, and Sato had seen the maw, the teeth, the impossible stretch of raw, wet tissue, and he had realized that there was no trick, no loophole, no clever escape from the horror that stood before him. "Kori demo?" she had asked, her voice still soft, still melodic, but now laced with an edge of something that might have been anger, might have been amusement. Sato had not waited to find out which. He had turned and run, his legs pumping, his lungs burning, his mind a white sheet of terror. He had run until he reached the main road, until he found a group of teenagers outside a convenience store, until he was surrounded by the noise and light of human activity. And then he had collapsed, vomiting into a trash can, his body shaking with a reaction that was part fear and part relief. "I thought I was safe," Sato said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I really did. I got home, I locked the door, I barricaded myself in my room. I didn't sleep, but I thought she couldn't get me if I was inside, if I was with other people, if I was in the light." He paused, his cigarette trembling in his fingers, and he looked at Kenji and Hana with eyes that were suddenly very young, very vulnerable. "I was wrong. She's been in my neighborhood every night since then. I've seen her from my window, standing under the streetlight looking up at my apartment. I've heard the scissors from the hallway outside my door. My parents think I'm having a breakdown. They want to send me to a hospital, but I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know she's going to kill me. It's just a matter of time." Kenji felt a surge of sympathy for the boy, mixed with a cold dread that was entirely selfish. If the Kuchisake was stalking Sato this aggressively, if she was escalating her presence from distant observation to active intrusion, then she was getting bolder, more confident, more hungry. And if she was getting bolder with Sato, she was probably getting bolder with all of them. "She's evolving," Kenji said, his voice low and urgent. "The legends say she asks the question and waits for an answer, but that's not what she's doing anymore. She's not waiting. She's hunting. She's marking her victims and then wearing them down, breaking their spirits, destroying their lives before she even touches them." Hana nodded, her face pale. "The candy on my pillow, the scissors outside Sato's door. She's inside our spaces now. She's invading our homes, our beds, our most private places. She's not just a monster in the alley anymore. She's a monster in our heads." "So what do we do?" Sato asked, crushing out his cigarette in the ashtray with more force than necessary. "How do we stop her? How do we make her go away?" Kenji spread his hands on the table, his fingers tracing the wood grain as if searching for answers in its patterns. "I don't know if we can stop her, but we can try to understand her. We can try to find a pattern, a weakness, a limit to her power. Everything has a limit, even supernatural things. If she were truly omnipotent, she would have killed us all already. The fact that she's playing with us, stalking us, dragging out the hunt, that suggests there's something holding her back, something we can exploit." "Like what?" Hana asked. "Like rules," Kenji said. "The legends say she asks the question. She follows a script. She needs permission in a way. She needs us to engage with her, to answer her, to acknowledge her existence. What if the key is not to answer at all? What if silence is our defense?" Sato shook his head, his face twisted with frustration. "I tried silence. I tried running without saying a word. She still came after me. She still found me." "Because you had already answered," Kenji said. "You said so. You engaged. You played the game. What if the only way to win is not to play?" The three of them sat in silence for a long moment, the sounds of the coffee shop swirling around them, the hiss of the espresso machine, the chatter of other customers, the clink of cups and spoons, a symphony of normalcy that seemed to mock their fear. Kenji looked out the window at the street beyond, at the people walking past with their shopping bags and their smartphones, oblivious to the conversation taking place just feet away, and he felt a profound sense of isolation, as if he had been severed from the human race by the simple fact of having seen something that should not exist. "We need to leave," Hana said suddenly, her voice sharp and decisive. "Not just the coffee shop, the city, the suburb. We need to get as far away from here as possible to a place where she's never been seen, where her legend has no power." "And go where?" Sato asked. "She found me in my apartment. She found Hana in her bed. What makes you think she won't find us wherever we go?" "Because legends are tied to places," Kenji said, his academic instincts taking over despite his fear. "Urban legends are geographic phenomena. They require a specific cultural and spatial context to manifest. The Kuchisake kana is a Japanese legend specific to the Tokyo area. If we leave Japan, go to a country where her story is unknown." "You're talking about running away," Sato interrupted, his voice rising. "About leaving everything behind, our families, our homes, our lives, because of some boogeyman in a mask. That's not a plan, that's surrender." "It's survival," Hana said softly. "And right now, survival is all that matters." They argued for another hour, their voices rising and falling, their coffee growing cold and their nerves fraying. Kenji advocated for research, for understanding, for finding a way to defeat the creature through knowledge. Hana insisted on flight, on putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the danger. Sato oscillated between bravado and despair, suggesting that they arm themselves, that they fight back, that they go down swinging rather than cowering in fear. None of them could agree on a course of action, and by the time they parted ways, the sun had set and the streets outside had grown dark. Kenji walked Hana to the train station, his eyes scanning the shadows, his hand clutching the bag of peppermint candies in his pocket. They stood on the platform, watching the trains come and go, and they spoke in low voices about the future, about the possibility of meeting again, of working together to find a solution. "Be careful," Kenji said as her train approached. "Don't go anywhere dark, don't walk alone, and if you see her—" "I know," Hana interrupted, her voice tight. "Run, scream, do whatever it takes." She stepped onto the train, turned to wave, and the doors closed behind her. Kenji watched the train pull away, its lights receding into the distance, and he felt a cold premonition that he would never see her again. He walked home through streets that seemed to have grown narrower, darker, more menacing since the afternoon. Every shadow was a potential hiding place, every alley a potential trap. He kept to the main roads, the well-lit avenues, the paths that were crowded with other people, but even there he felt her presence, a weight upon his consciousness that was not quite visible but was undeniably real. He reached his apartment building without incident, rode the elevator to his floor, and let himself into his unit with trembling fingers. He locked the door, threw the bolt, and leaned against the wood, his body shaking with delayed reaction. He was safe. For now. He walked to the bathroom, intending to splash cold water on his face to try to calm his nerves before attempting sleep. He flicked on the light and looked in the mirror, and what he saw made his blood freeze in his veins. Behind him, reflected in the glass, stood a figure in a trench coat. She was not in the bathroom. She was in the mirror or behind the mirror or somehow both at once. Her head was tilted in that bird-like gesture, and though her face was hidden by the mask, Kenji could feel her eyes upon him, could sense the weight of her gaze like a physical pressure against his spine. He spun around, his heart hammering, but the bathroom was empty. He turned back to the mirror and she was gone, but on the surface of the glass, written in what looked like condensation but smelled like blood, were two words: Kori Demo. Kenji stumbled backward, his heel catching on the bath mat, and he fell against the wall, sliding down to the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. She was inside. She was in his home, in his bathroom, in his mirror. There was no place safe from her, no distance far enough, no barrier strong enough. She had marked him, and the mark was permanent, indelible, written not on his skin but on his soul. He sat on the bathroom floor for hours, too frightened to move, too frightened to sleep, watching the mirror for any sign of her return. The words faded slowly, evaporating like the condensation they resembled, but their presence lingered, a ghostly residue that seemed to cling to the glass even after the surface was dry. When dawn finally began to lighten the sky outside his window, Kenji rose, stiff and aching, and he made a decision. He would not wait for her to come to him. He would not cower in his apartment, waiting for the inevitable. He would find the other survivors, find Hana and Sato, and together they would leave. They would go to the train station, board the first train out of the city, and they would not stop until they were far away in a place where the legends were different, where the Kuchisake had no power. He packed a bag with clothes, his wallet, his phone, and the bag of peppermint candies that had become his talisman. He called Hana's number, but there was no answer. He called again and again, but the phone rang and rang, eventually going to voicemail. He left a message, his voice shaking, telling her to meet him at the central train station at noon, that they were leaving, that they needed to stick together. He tried Sato's number next, but it was disconnected, the automated voice telling him that the number was no longer in service. Kenji felt a cold hand close around his heart. Something had happened to them. Something had happened in the hours since they had parted. The Kuchisake was not waiting anymore. She was acting, and she was acting fast. He left his apartment, his bag slung over his shoulder, and he walked to the train station with a sense of urgency that bordered on panic. The morning streets were crowded with commuters, businessmen in suits and women in office attire, students in uniforms and deliverymen on bicycles, all moving with the purposeful stride of people who had places to be and schedules to keep. Kenji moved among them like a ghost, his eyes scanning the faces around him, searching for any sign of the mask, any hint of the trench coat, any glint of the scissors. He reached the station at 11:30, half an hour early, and he positioned himself near the central clock where he could watch the entrances and the platforms. He waited, his hands sweating, his heart hammering, his eyes never still. At 11:45 he saw Hana. She was walking toward him from the direction of the ticket gates, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. She spotted him and hurried over, her movements stiff and jerky, as if she were fighting the urge to run in the opposite direction. "I got your message," she said, her voice barely audible above the noise of the station. "I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing her, hearing the scissors. I can't stay here anymore, Kenji, I can't." "I know," Kenji said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We're leaving together as soon as Sato arrives." Hana's face paled further. "Sato? I tried to call him this morning. His mother answered, she said he didn't come home last night. He went out after we met and he never came back." Kenji felt the blood drain from his face. "Did she call the police?" "She did, but they said teenagers run away all the time. They said they'd file a report, but they didn't seem very concerned." Kenji looked around the station, his eyes scanning the crowd with a desperation that was almost frantic. Sato was not coming. Sato was already gone, another victim of the Kuchisake-hana's escalating hunger. And if Sato was gone, then Kenji and Hana were next. "We can't wait," Kenji said, grabbing Hana's arm. "We need to leave now, right now, before she finds us here." They bought tickets for the first express train, a departure in 20 minutes that would take them south, away from Tokyo, away from the suburbs, away from the legend that had consumed their lives. They walked to the platform, their steps hurried, their eyes darting, and they waited for the train with a tension that was almost unbearable. The platform was crowded, filled with travelers and commuters, and Kenji tried to lose himself in the crowd, to become invisible among the masses of people. But he could not shake the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, of being marked for a death that was now only minutes away. The train arrived with a hiss of brakes and a rush of air, its doors sliding open to reveal the brightly lit interior. Kenji and Hana pushed forward, elbowing their way through the crowd, and they found seats near the back of the car, their bags clutched to their chests, their bodies pressed together for comfort and protection. The doors began to close, and Kenji felt a surge of relief that was almost dizzying. They were leaving. They were escaping. They were going to survive. And then the lights in the car flickered. Once, twice, 3 times, and then they went out completely, plunging the car into a darkness that was absolute, unbroken by any source of light. The other passengers gasped and murmured, their voices rising in complaint and confusion. But Kenji and Hana did not speak. They sat in the darkness, their hands clasped together, their hearts hammering in unison, and they waited. The lights came back on, slowly, dimly, casting a sickly yellow glow that was more disturbing than the darkness had been. And in the renewed light, Kenji saw that the car was empty. The other passengers were gone. The seats that had been filled with businessmen and students and families were now vacant. Their occupants vanished as if they had never been there at all. Kenji and Hana were alone in the car, alone on the train, alone in a world that had suddenly become very small and very terrifying. "Where did they go?" Hana whispered, her voice cracking. "Where did everyone go?" Kenji did not answer. He was staring at the far end of the car, where the connecting door to the next car stood open. In the doorway, silhouetted against the darkness beyond, stood a figure in a trench coat. She was holding the scissors, and she was tilting her head in that bird-like gesture, and though he could not see her face, Kenji knew that she was smiling beneath the mask. "Watashi, Kairi?" she asked, her voice carrying the length of the car with that same unnatural clarity, that same rehearsed sweetness. And Kenji, his mind breaking under the weight of impossible fear, reached into his pocket and found it empty. The bag of peppermint candies was gone. He had dropped it somewhere, or she had taken it, or it had never been there at all. He had no candy. He had no coins. He had no tricks, no loopholes, no clever answers. He had only the truth, and the truth was that he was going to die. The scissors snapped shut with a sound like a final judgment, and the Kuchisake stepped into the car, her movements slow and deliberate and utterly inevitable. Kenji closed his eyes and waited for the darkness to swallow him whole. But Kenji did not die in that train car, though he would spend the rest of his life wishing that he had. The Kuchisake advanced upon them with a slow, deliberate stride, her scissors rising and falling in a rhythmic motion that seemed to synchronize with the hammering of Kenji's heart. And just as she reached the midpoint of the car, the train lurched. It was not a normal lurch, not the result of brakes or acceleration, but a violent, sideways shift that threw the Kuchisake off balance and sent her stumbling against the seats. Kenji seized the moment, grabbing Hana's hand and pulling her toward the emergency exit at the far end of the car. They ran, their feet pounding against the floor, their breath coming in ragged gasps, and they reached the exit door just as the train screeched to a halt, the force of the deceleration sending them both sprawling against the wall. The doors hissed open, and they tumbled out onto the platform, not the platform of a station but a stretch of track that ran through a residential district, the houses rising on either side like the walls of a canyon. They scrambled to their feet and ran, not looking back, their minds filled only with the need to escape, to survive, to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the monster in the train. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs turned to jelly, and then they ran some more, following the tracks through back streets and alleys, past darkened houses and shuttered shops, until they reached a main road where traffic still flowed and lights still burned. They collapsed against a bus stop shelter, gasping, their bodies shaking with exhaustion and terror, and they looked at each other with eyes that held no hope, only the grim determination of animals who have escaped the trap but know that the hunter is still following. "She's getting stronger," Hana panted, her face streaked with sweat and tears. She was in the train, Kenji, inside a moving vehicle surrounded by people. She's not just an alley monster anymore. She's everywhere. Kenji nodded, his chest heaving, his mind racing. We need to get to the main station, the central hub. There will be security police cameras. She won't be able to operate there. You don't know that, Hana said. You don't know anything anymore. None of your theories, none of your research, none of your rational explanations mean anything in the face of what's happening. She's real, she's hunting us, and she's winning. Kenji had no answer. He pushed himself up from the bus stop bench and helped Hana to her feet, and together they began walking toward the lights of the city center, toward the crowded streets and the busy stations, toward the illusion of safety that numbers provided. They walked for an hour, maybe longer, keeping to the main roads, avoiding the alleys and the shadows. The streets grew more crowded as they approached the central district, the nightlife of Tokyo in full swing, the restaurants and bars and clubs spilling light and noise onto the sidewalks. Kenji felt some of the tension drain from his shoulders as they merged with the crowds, becoming just two more faces in a sea of faces, anonymous and unremarkable. But the relief was short-lived. As they turned a corner onto a street that led directly to the central train station, the lights began to flicker. Not all at once, but in sequence, starting at the far end of the street and moving toward them like a wave, each streetlight guttering and dying as the wave approached, plunging the street into a darkness that advanced with terrifying speed. The people around them noticed, their laughter dying, their conversations faltering, their faces turning upward with expressions of confusion and concern. And then the darkness reached them and the streetlights went out and the darkness was absolute. Kenji grabbed Hana's hand, squeezing it until his knuckles turned white, and he strained his eyes against the blackness, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of the trench coat, any glint of the scissors. "She's here," Hana whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can smell her, the perfume, the flowers. The blood." Kenji smelled it too, the sweet, cloying scent that he had first detected in the alley, now stronger, more concentrated, as if the darkness itself were exuding it. The people around them began to panic, their confusion turning to fear, their voices rising in a cacophony of alarm. Someone screamed, a high, piercing sound that was cut short with a wet, terrible finality. The crowd surged, bodies pushing and shoving, people running in all directions, their faces illuminated by the screens of their phones, which cast a pale, bluish light that made them look like ghosts. Kenji and Hana were swept along by the crowd, their hands torn apart by the press of bodies, and Kenji lost sight of Hana in the chaos. He called her name, his voice lost in the screaming, and he fought against the current of the crowd, trying to reach the spot where he had last seen her. Another scream, closer this time, followed by a sound that Kenji would never forget. The wet, tearing sound of flesh being parted, the crunch of bone, the snap of the scissors closing with a terrible efficiency. The crowd parted, people falling back in a wave of terror, and Kenji found himself at the edge of a small clearing in the chaos, a space where the darkness seemed deeper, thicker, more substantial. In the center of the clearing stood the Kuchisake, her trench coat hanging open to reveal a body that was wrong in its proportions, too thin, too elongated, its joints bending in directions that human joints should not bend. She was feeding. That was the only word Kenji could find for it. She had hold of a man in a business suit, a stranger who had been unlucky enough to be near her when the darkness fell, and she was bringing the scissors up and down in a rhythmic motion that was almost surgical in its precision. The man's face was already gone, peeled away in strips that hung from his jaw like ribbons, and his body twitched with the last, involuntary spasms of a nervous system that had not yet realized it was dead. The Kuchisake lifted her head from her work, her mask still in place, and she looked directly at Kenji. He could not see her eyes, but he could feel them upon him, could sense the weight of her attention like a physical force. She dropped the body, which fell to the pavement with a wet thud, and she began to move toward him, her stride slow and deliberate, the scissors dripping with blood that was black in the phone light. "Watashi Kairi?" she asked, her voice carrying over the screaming, over the chaos, over the pounding of Kenji's heart. But this time Kenji did not answer. He turned and ran, pushing through the crowd, his feet pounding against the pavement, his mind a blank sheet of pure survival instinct. He ran toward the train station, its lights still burning in the distance, a beacon of false hope in a world that had gone mad. Behind him, he heard the sound of the scissors, the rhythmic snip, snip, snip that seemed to follow him like a metronome, keeping time with his terror. He did not look back. He could not. He reached the entrance to the station, the grand archway that led to the platforms, and he threw himself through the doors, colliding with a group of tourists who shouted in surprise and anger. He ignored them, scanning the crowd for Hana, calling her name, his voice cracking with desperation. And then he saw her. She was standing near the ticket machines, her face pale, her eyes wide, her body trembling. She saw him and ran toward him, and they embraced with a force that was born of terror rather than affection, their bodies clinging together like drowning swimmers. "She's killing everyone," Hana sobbed, her face pressed against Kenji's chest. "She's not just hunting us anymore. She's clearing the streets. She's turning the whole suburb into a graveyard." Kenji held her, his mind racing. The station was crowded, filled with travelers and commuters, but he knew that the crowd offered no protection. The Kuchisake had already proven that she could operate in crowded spaces, that she could manifest wherever the darkness was deep enough, the shadows thick enough. They needed to get out, to leave the city, to escape to a place where her legend had no foothold. "The train," he said, pulling back to look into Hana's eyes. "The last express. It leaves in 5 minutes. If we can get on it, if we can leave the district." Hana nodded, though her face showed that she had little faith in the plan. Together they ran toward the platform, pushing through the crowds, their hands clasped together. The platform was packed with people waiting for the late-night departures, and Kenji scanned the boards, his eyes finding the express train that would take them south, away from Tokyo, away from the horror. It was boarding now, its doors open, passengers streaming aboard. They pushed through the crowd, elbowing their way to the front, and they reached the door just as a voice announced the final boarding call. Kenji helped Hana onto the train, then turned to follow her, and stopped. Standing on the platform, not 3 feet away, was Sato, or what was left of Sato. The boy's leather jacket was torn and stained, his shaved head covered in blood that was already drying to a crust. His face was pale, too pale, and his eyes, which had been a pale gray in the coffee shop, were now completely white. The pupils vanished into a milky blankness that suggested blindness but somehow still seemed to see. He was holding the scissors, not his own but the Kuchisake, the large, gleaming blades that caught the station lights and reflected them back with a malevolent sparkle. "Sato," Kenji whispered, his voice barely audible. "Sato, what happened to you?" The boy's mouth opened, and the sound that emerged was not a voice but a wet, gurgling rasp that seemed to come from deep in his throat. "She chose me," the thing that had been Sato said. "She made me, part of her, part of the legend, and now I hunt too, I hunt for her. For the beautiful one." He raised the scissors, and Kenji saw that the boy's mouth was wrong, that the corners of his lips had been extended, slashed backward toward his ears in a crude imitation of the Kuchisake's own maw. The wound was fresh, the blood still oozing, and Sato's jaw worked spasmodically as he tried to speak through the damage. "Run, Kenji," Sato gurgled, and for a moment Kenji heard the boy's real voice beneath the corruption, a flash of the frightened teenager he had met in the coffee shop. "Run while you still can. She's behind you. She's always behind you." Kenji did not need to be told twice. He spun around, and there she was, standing in the aisle of the train car, her mask gleaming, her scissors raised. She had bypassed the platform entirely, manifesting inside the train itself, and Kenji realized with a sinking heart that there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, no escape from the creature that had marked him for death. Hana screamed, a sound of pure, primal terror, and she backed away down the aisle, her hands raised in a gesture of futile defense. The other passengers were oblivious, their faces turned toward their phones or their newspapers, unable or unwilling to see the horror that walked among them. Kenji felt a surge of desperate courage, a refusal to die cowering, and he reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the last object he had brought with him. A lighter, a cheap disposable thing that he used to light candles during power outages. He flicked it open, the flame springing to life with a soft whoosh, and he held it out before him like a weapon. "You want me," he shouted, his voice cracking but loud enough to turn heads. "Then come and get me." The Kuchisake paused, her head tilting in that bird-like gesture, and for a moment Kenji thought he saw something in her posture that might have been surprise or perhaps amusement. Then she moved, faster than he could follow, and the scissors slashed through the air where his throat had been a fraction of a second before. Kenji stumbled backward, the lighter falling from his hand, and he felt a hot line of pain across his cheek as the blade grazed him, opening a shallow wound that spilled blood down his face. He fell against the seats, his vision swimming, and he watched as the Kuchisake advanced upon him, her scissors rising for the final blow. And then Hana was there, lunging forward with a fire extinguisher that she had ripped from the wall, swinging it with all her strength at the creature's head. The metal cylinder struck the Kuchisake with a sound like a bell being rung, and she staggered, her scissors falling from her hand, her body swaying. It was not enough to kill her, not enough to destroy her, but it was enough to create an opening. "Go!" Hana screamed, throwing the extinguisher at the creature and grabbing Kenji's arm. "Go, go, go!" They ran, pushing through the oblivious passengers toward the far end of the car. The Kuchisake recovered quickly, her scissors back in her hand, her stride lengthening as she pursued them. They reached the connecting door to the next car and threw themselves through it, slamming it shut behind them. But the door was just a door, just a thin partition of metal and glass, and they both knew that it would not hold her for more than a moment. "The window," Kenji gasped, pointing to the emergency exit window at the end of the car. "We break it, we jump." Hana stared at him. "We're moving at 60 kilometers an hour. We'll be killed." "We'll be killed if we stay," Kenji shouted. He grabbed the emergency hammer from its bracket and swung it at the window, the glass shattering into 1,000 fragments that sprayed outward into the night. Cold air flooded the car, the sound of the wheels on the tracks rising to a deafening roar. Kenji looked out at the ground rushing by, a blur of gravel and concrete and steel, and he felt his stomach turn with vertigo. Behind them the connecting door opened, and the Kuchisake stepped through, her mask still in place, her scissors gleaming. "Jump!" Kenji screamed, and he grabbed Hana's hand and pulled her toward the opening. They leaped together, their bodies tumbling through the shattered window, the night air rushing past them, the ground rising to meet them with terrifying speed. Kenji hit the ground shoulder first, rolling with the impact, feeling bones crack and flesh tear as he bounced and skidded along the gravel embankment. He rolled to a stop, his body a symphony of pain, and he lay there for a moment, gasping, his vision filled with stars. Then he forced himself up, his left arm hanging useless at his side, his face covered in blood and gravel, and he looked for Hana. She was lying a few meters away, her body twisted at an unnatural angle, her eyes open and staring at the sky. Kenji stumbled to her, his heart hammering, and he knelt beside her, his trembling hand reaching for her pulse. It was there, faint but present, a thread of life in a body that had been broken by the fall. "Hana," he whispered. "Hana, can you hear me?" Her eyes moved slowly, focusing on his face with an effort that seemed to drain the last of her strength. "Kenji," she breathed, I can't feel my legs." "Don't move," Kenji said, though he knew that moving was the least of their concerns. "The train is gone, she's gone. We're safe." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were a lie. The Kuchisake was not bound by trains or tracks or the laws of physics. She was a spirit, a legend, a force of nature that could manifest wherever the conditions were right. And the conditions were always right when the darkness was deep enough, when the fear was strong enough, when the victim was marked. They lay there on the gravel embankment, two broken people in a broken world, listening to the distant sound of the train receding into the night. Kenji held Hana's hand, feeling her grip weaken with each passing minute, feeling the life drain out of her with a slowness that was more terrible than any sudden death could have been. "I'm sorry," Hana whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I'm sorry I couldn't run faster. Couldn't be stronger." "You were strong," Kenji said, tears streaming down his face mixing with the blood and the gravel. "You were the strongest person I know. You saved my life. You saved me." Hana smiled, a small, sad smile that was the most beautiful thing Kenji had ever seen. "Tell my mother, tell her I love her. Tell her I'm sorry I didn't come home." Her eyes fluttered closed and her hand went limp in Kenji's grasp. Kenji sat there for a long time holding her hand, his body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest, somewhere in the core of his being. He cried for Hana, for Sato, for all the victims of the Kuchisake who had died without understanding, without hope, without anyone to hold their hand at the end. He cried for himself, for the life he had lost, the future he had imagined that would now never come to pass. And he cried for the world, for the cruel, indifferent universe that allowed such horrors to exist, that created monsters from the pain and vanity of human souls and set them loose to prey upon the innocent. When his tears finally ran dry, he forced himself to stand, his broken body screaming in protest, and he began to walk. He did not know where he was going. He did not know if he was walking toward help or away from it. He only knew that he could not stay here, not with Hana's body cooling beside him, not with the memory of the Kuchisake scissors still fresh in his mind. He walked along the tracks, his feet stumbling, his vision blurred, his mind a numb blank. Eventually he reached a road, a small country lane that ran parallel to the tracks, and he followed it until he reached a farmhouse where an elderly couple took him in, fed him, and called an ambulance. The police came, and Kenji told them a story about a train accident, about falling from a window during a robbery, about Hana's death and his own injuries. They believed him, or at least they pretended to believe him, and they filed their reports and closed their files and told him to get rest. But Kenji could not rest. He spent 3 days in a rural hospital, his broken arm in a cast, his face stitched and bandaged, his body healing but his mind shattered. He refused to sleep, afraid of what he might see in his dreams. He refused to look in mirrors, afraid of what might be looking back. And he refused to return to Tokyo, knowing that the Kuchisake was waiting for him there, patient and eternal. On the 4th day, he discharged himself against medical advice and caught a bus to a city in the south, a place he had never been, where no one knew his name. He found a cheap apartment, a room above a restaurant that smelled of frying oil and garlic, and he tried to build a new life. He found work as a dishwasher, then as a delivery driver, then as a night security guard at a construction site. The work was mindless, physical, exhausting, and that was exactly what he needed. He did not want to think. He did not want to remember. He wanted only to exist, to move through the days like a ghost, unseen and unseeing. But the Kuchisake did not forget her marks. She did not abandon her prey. She waited and she watched and she bided her time. Kenji felt her presence in the months that followed, a cold weight upon his consciousness that never lifted, never wavered. He saw her in the shadows of alleyways, standing at the end of darkened streets, watching him from rooftops and windows. He heard the scissors in the night, the rhythmic snip 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 that seemed to come from just outside his door, just beyond his window. And he smelled the perfume, the sweet, cloying scent of funeral flowers and old blood that followed him wherever he went. He moved 3 more times, each time to a different city, each time to a place that was brighter, more crowded, more anonymous. But she always found him. She was patient. She had all the time in the world. And Kenji began to understand that there was no escape, no refuge, no distance far enough to outrun a legend. The Kuchisake was not a ghost bound to a place. She was an idea, a story, a fear that lived in the minds of millions of people, and as long as those people believed in her, she would exist. She would hunt, she would kill, and she would never ever stop. A year passed. Kenji's wounds healed, leaving scars that were physical and scars that were not. The slash across his cheek had been stitched by a doctor who had commented on its unusual neatness, as if it had been made with surgical precision rather than the violence of a pair of scissors. The scar ran from the corner of his mouth to his ear, a pale line that stood out against his skin like a signature, a brand. He grew his hair long to cover it, but it was always there, a reminder of the night that had changed everything. He learned to live with the fear, to function despite the constant sensation of being watched. He went to work, he ate his meals, he slept his fitful sleep. But he never relaxed, never let his guard down, never allowed himself to believe that he was safe. Because he knew, with a certainty that was beyond doubt, that she was still there, still waiting, still patient. And then, one evening, exactly 1 year after the night of the train, Kenji found himself in the city center, surrounded by the bright lights and the crowds of people that he had come to depend upon for his sense of safety. He was walking past a department store, its windows filled with mannequins dressed in the latest fashions, when he felt a sudden, cold breeze that seemed to come from nowhere, cutting through the warm summer air like a knife. He stopped, his heart hammering, his hand reaching instinctively for the peppermint candy that he still carried in his pocket, a habit that he had never been able to break. He looked into the window of the department store, his reflection staring back at him among the mannequins and the displays. And behind his reflection, standing just over his shoulder, was a woman in a trench coat. She was wearing a surgical mask, white and pristine, and she was tilting her head in that bird-like gesture that Kenji had come to know better than his own face. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her presence was the question, and the answer was written in the terror that flooded Kenji's veins, the paralysis that gripped his limbs, the scream that died in his throat. He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the candy, and he pulled it out, holding it before him like an offering, like a prayer, like the last desperate gesture of a drowning man. But his fingers were shaking so badly that he dropped it, the candy falling to the pavement and rolling away into the gutter, lost among the feet of the passing crowds. Kenji looked down at his empty hand, and then he looked back at the window. The woman was gone. But on the glass, written in the condensation that had formed in the shape of her breath, were 2 words, Kori Demo. Kenji stood there for a long time, staring at the words, feeling the cold breeze on his neck, listening to the scissors that he could hear somewhere in the distance, somewhere just around the corner, somewhere coming closer. He thought about running, about screaming, about throwing himself into the crowd and hoping that the numbers would protect him. But he knew that there was no protection, no safety, no escape from the thing that had marked him. The Kuchisake was not a monster that could be defeated or outsmarted. She was a truth, a revelation, the embodiment of the lie that underpinned all human beauty, all human vanity, all human interaction. She was the gap between what we see and what is real, and she would always be there, waiting for us to look into the mirror and tell her the truth. Kenji reached up and touched the scar on his cheek, feeling its raised, pale line beneath his fingers. He thought about Hana, about Sato, about all the others who had answered the question and paid the price. And then he lowered his hand and turned away from the window, walking into the crowd, into the light, into the noise and the life of the city. The scissors snipped somewhere behind him, a sound that was almost lost in the bustle of the street. But Kenji did not look back. He walked on, his head high, his steps steady, and he did not stop until he reached the edge of the city, where the buildings gave way to fields and the lights gave way to stars. And there, in the darkness of the countryside, he finally stopped, and he waited and he listened. The scissors were closer now. He could smell the perfume, sweet and cloying, could feel the cold breeze on his neck, could sense the presence behind him like a weight upon his soul. He did not turn around. He did not need to. He knew what he would see. Instead, he reached into his pocket one last time and he found it empty. No candy, no coins, no tricks, no escape. Just the truth, and the truth was that he was beautiful. He was beautiful and he was marked and he was hers. The scissors snapped shut with a sound that was almost gentle, almost loving, and Kenji closed his eyes and waited for the darkness to swallow him whole. In the distance, a train whistle blew, long and low, like a lullaby for the dead. And the peppermint candy, which had dissolved on 1,000 tongues and in 1,000 mouths, was nothing but a memory now, a sweetness that had turned to ash, a taste that would linger forever in the mouths of those who had survived, those who had answered, those who had learned that the scar was the truth and the truth was the scar. And the Kuchisake, beautiful and terrible, eternal and unforgiving, moved on through the night, her scissors gleaming, her mask hiding the maw that was not a wound but a doorway, not a scar but a revelation, and she asked her question of the darkness, and the darkness answered, and the hunt continued, forever and ever, amen. The canopy's weight. The first thing Elias found when he pushed through the undergrowth was a pair of leather hiking boots dangling 6 feet above the forest floor, suspended by a single, jagged piece of bone that had pierced through the leather, and the ankle of the wearer with a precision that suggested neither accident nor random violence. There was no sound of screaming accompanying the discovery, only the rhythmic, wet thump-thump-thump of something heavy being dragged upward through the leaves, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the forest itself were breathing, or swallowing, or digesting. Elias stood there for a long moment, his hands still clutching the branch he had pushed aside, his eyes tracking upward from the boots to the leg that extended into the canopy, to the body that was being hauled into the darkness above with a slow, inexorable motion that reminded him of a fisherman reeling in a catch. He should have screamed. He should have run. He should have done any of 100 things that a rational human being would do upon discovering a corpse being dragged into the trees by an unseen predator. But Elias was not, and had never been, a rational human being in the conventional sense. He was a man of obsessions, of fixations, of passions that burned with an intensity that consumed everything in their path, and the current object of his obsession, the Sliver Cat, the legendary, fearsome critter of the Appalachian high country, had brought him here, to this remote stretch of ancient wilderness, to this moment of confrontation with something that his rational mind told him was impossible, but his gut told him was inevitable. Elias was 42 years old, a former professor of zoology at a small liberal arts college in Virginia, who had resigned his position 5 years prior after a series of increasingly acrimonious disputes with his department chair over the legitimacy of crypto-zoological research. He had spent the intervening years living off a modest inheritance, traveling to remote locations around the world in search of creatures that mainstream science refused to acknowledge. The Yeti in the Himalayas, the Loch Ness Monster in Scotland, the Chupacabra in Mexico. He had found nothing, or at least nothing that could be definitively proven, but he had accumulated a wealth of anecdotal evidence, a network of informants and witnesses, and a reputation in the cryptozoological community as a man who was slightly mad but fundamentally honest, willing to follow the evidence wherever it led, even if it led to ridicule and ruin. The Sliver Cat had first come to his attention 3 years ago, when he had encountered a leather-bound journal in the archives of a historical society in Asheville, North Carolina. The journal had belonged to a man named Jedediah Crow, an 18th-century frontiersman who had ranged deep into the Appalachian wilderness in search of fur and fortune, and who had returned from his expeditions with stories that his contemporaries had dismissed as the ravings of a man driven mad by solitude and hardship. But Crow's descriptions had been too detailed, too consistent, too anatomically precise to be dismissed as mere hallucination. He had described a creature that was like unto a cat, but larger than any cat that walketh the earth, being of the size of a small horse, with a coat the color of dead leaves and eyes that burn like coals in the darkness. He had described its most distinctive feature, a tail that was longer by far than the body itself, being some 11 foot from root to tip, and armed at the end with a cruel hook of bone, like unto the thagomizer of the stegosaurus, which it useth to seize its prey and draw them upward into the trees where it may devour them at leisure. Elias had read these descriptions with a thrill of recognition that had bordered on the religious. Here was a creature that was not merely a legend but a biological entity, a predator that had evolved in isolation in the high canopy of the Appalachians, its existence preserved only in the oral traditions of frontiersmen and the whispered fears of hunters who had ventured too deep into the ancient forests. He had spent 3 years researching the Sliver Cat, poring over old journals and hunting logs, interviewing local historians and forest rangers, building a case that was circumstantial but compelling. And then, 6 months ago, he had formed the expedition. He had recruited 7 other enthusiasts, amateur naturalists and self-styled cryptozoologists who shared his passion and his disregard for conventional scientific caution. There was Marcus, a wealthy software engineer from San Francisco who had funded the expedition and who carried a camera rig that cost more than most people's cars. There was Priya, a wildlife biologist from India who had come to the United States to study American megafauna and who had been drawn to Elia's research by its scientific rigor. There were the Chen twins, David and Daniel, graduate students in ecology who had written their theses on predator-prey dynamics and who saw the expedition as an opportunity to apply their knowledge in the field. There was Big Joe, a former Marine and current hunting guide who had grown up in the Appalachians and who claimed to have heard stories of the Sliver Cat from his grandfather. There was Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, a veterinarian who had specialized in large cats and who had joined the expedition to provide medical expertise in case of injury. And there was the youngest member of the group, a 19-year-old college dropout named Tyler who had attached himself to the expedition after meeting Elias at a cryptozoology conference and who had proven himself surprisingly useful as a camp cook and general dog's body. They had entered the wilderness 2 weeks prior, hiking deep into a stretch of the Appalachian forest that had been designated as a primitive area, off-limits to logging and development, a place where the trees were centuries old and the canopy was so thick that sunlight barely reached the forest floor. They had established a base camp near a stream, setting up tents and equipment, and had spent the first week conducting systematic surveys of the area, looking for signs of the creature, tracks, scratch marks on trees, anything that might indicate the presence of a large predator. They had found nothing conclusive, only the usual signs of bear and deer and the smaller mammals that populated the forest, and morale had begun to sag as the days passed without any sign of the Sliver Cat. But Elias had not been discouraged. He had known, with the deep certainty of a man who had devoted his life to a single quest, that the creature was here somewhere, watching them from the canopy, waiting for them to venture deep enough into its territory to trigger a response. And now, standing in the undergrowth, watching the boots being dragged upward into the leaves, he knew that he had been right. The Sliver Cat was real, and it was feeding. Elias. The voice was Marcus's, shouting from somewhere behind him, back at the trail they had been following. Elias, where are you? We need to keep moving if we're going to reach the ridge by nightfall. Elias did not answer. He could not tear his eyes away from the boots, from the leg that was slowly disappearing into the canopy, from the wet, rhythmic sound of dragging that seemed to be growing fainter as the creature hauled its prey deeper into the trees. He knew, with a sick certainty, that the boots belonged to one of his team. They were the boots that Big Joe had been wearing that morning, the heavy leather hikers that the former Marine had broken in over decades of hunting and guiding. Big Joe had gone ahead to scout the trail, had vanished into the undergrowth with a wave and a grin, and now his boots were being pulled into the canopy by something that Elias had spent 3 years trying to find. Elias. Marcus's voice again, closer now, accompanied by the sound of branches being pushed aside. What the hell are you doing? We've been looking for you for. Marcus emerged from the undergrowth, his camera rig bouncing against his chest, his face flushed with exertion and irritation. He followed Elias' gaze upward, his eyes tracking from the boots to the leg to the canopy, and his mouth fell open in a scream that was silent for a long moment before it finally found voice. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, Joe, that's Joe's boots, oh my God. Marcus stumbled backward, his hands clutching at his camera as if it were a talisman, his eyes wide and unblinking. "We have to help him, we have to get him down, we have to—" "He's already dead," Elias said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Look at the angle of the leg. The bone has been severed at the ankle. The hook went straight through. He's been gone for minutes, maybe longer, and whatever took him, it's up there, in the trees." Marcus looked up at the canopy, his face pale, his body shaking. "What is it? What's doing this?" "The Sliver Cat," Elias said, and there was a note of triumph in his voice that was obscene in its inappropriateness. "It's real, Marcus. It's real, and it's here, and we've found it." Marcus stared at him, his expression shifting from terror to disbelief to something that might have been disgust. "You son of a bitch," he whispered. "Joe is dead. He's being eaten by something in the trees, and you're standing there gloating because you were right. What the hell is wrong with you?" Elias had no answer. He watched as the boots gave a final lurch and disappeared into the canopy, the wet sound of dragging fading to silence. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the normal sounds of birds and insects falling quiet, replaced by a stillness that was profound and terrible. And then from somewhere high above, there came a sound that Elias would remember for the rest of his life. A low, rumbling purr like the idling of a distant engine, mixed with a wet, tearing sound that suggested the creature was feeding, was consuming its prey with a satisfaction that was almost sensual. "We need to get back to camp," Elias said, his voice returning to something approximating normal. "We need to warn the others." We need to get out of here," Marcus interrupted, his voice cracking. "We need to run right now and not stop until we're back in civilization. I don't care about your monster, Elias. I don't care about your research. I care about living, and if we stay here, we're going to die." Elias shook his head, his obsession reasserting itself over his fear. "We can't leave now, not when we've finally found it. This is the discovery of a lifetime, Marcus. The Sliver Cat, a new species. Think of what this means for science, for our understanding of evolution, of predator-prey dynamics, of—" "Screw science," Marcus screamed, his composure finally breaking. "Screw your research and your discoveries and your obsession with monsters. Joe is dead. Do you understand that? Dead. And the thing that killed him is up there in the trees, and it's going to kill us too if we don't get out of here right now." Elias opened his mouth to argue, to plead, to convince Marcus to stay, but the words died in his throat as a shadow passed overhead, a dark shape that moved through the canopy with a fluidity that was impossible for any terrestrial animal. It was large, larger than any cat had a right to be, its body elongated and sinuous, its tail, that impossible 11-foot tail, trailing behind it like a whip. The tail ended in a cluster of bone-white spikes, a thagomizer that gleamed in the dappled sunlight, and as the creature passed, it turned its head, and Elias saw its eyes. They were horizontal slits of red, like the eyes of a reptile, but with an intelligence that was unmistakably mammalian, an awareness that spoke of cunning and patience and predatory focus. The Sliver Cat looked down at Elias, its gaze locking with his for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, and then it was gone, vanished into the leaves with a silence that was more terrifying than any roar could have been. Marcus had seen it too. He stood frozen, his camera forgotten in his hands, his mouth open in a silent scream. "It saw us," he whispered. "It looked at us, it knows we're here." "Yes," Elias said, his voice barely audible. "It knows, and now the hunt begins." They ran back to camp, crashing through the undergrowth with a disregard for stealth that would have appalled them under normal circumstances. Branches whipped their faces, roots tripped their feet, and thorns tore at their clothes and skin, but they did not slow, did not stop, did not dare to look back. The camp was a clearing by the stream, a space that had seemed idyllic when they had established it 2 weeks ago but now felt exposed and vulnerable, a killing floor surrounded by walls of green. The others were there, Priya, the Chen twins, Dr. Okonkwo, Tyler, and they looked up from their various tasks with expressions of alarm as Elias and Marcus burst into the clearing, their faces scratched and bleeding, their eyes wild with terror. "Big Joe is dead," Elias gasped. bending over with his hands on his knees, his lungs burning from the run. Something took him. In the trees. It's the Sliver Cat, it's real, and it's hunting us. The reactions varied. Priya paled, her hand going to her mouth. The Chen twins exchanged glances that were equal parts skepticism and fear. Dr. Okonkwo immediately began gathering medical supplies, her veterinary instincts kicking in despite the absurdity of the situation. And Tyler, the youngest member of the group, laughed, a high, nervous sound that was more hysteria than humor. "You're joking," Tyler said. "This is some kind of team-building exercise, right? A scare to keep us on our toes." "Look at me," Elias snarled, grabbing the boy by his shirt collar and pulling him close. "Look at my face. Do these scratches look like a joke? Big Joe is dead. I saw his body being dragged into the canopy by a creature with a tail like a whip and spikes like daggers. It looked at me. It knows we're here. And it is going to kill us all unless we get out of here right now." Tyler's laughter died, his face draining of color as he looked into Elias' eyes and saw the truth there. "Oh my God," he whispered. "Oh my God." The group erupted into chaos, voices rising in panic, everyone talking at once, no one listening. Priya suggested they radio for help, but Marcus reminded her that the radios had stopped working 3 days ago, their signals blocked by the dense canopy and the mountainous terrain. David Chen proposed they arm themselves with the hunting rifles that Big Joe had brought, but a search of Joe's tent revealed that the rifles were gone, presumably taken by the creature along with their owner. Daniel Chen suggested climbing trees, getting to higher ground, but one look at the canopy above them. The way the branches seemed to weave together into a solid ceiling of green and brown was enough to convince them that the trees were not refuge, but danger, the domain of the thing that hunted them. "We stick together," Elias said, raising his voice to be heard above the din. "We move as a group, we keep our eyes on the canopy, and we head for the trailhead. It's 4 miles from here, maybe 5. If we move fast, we can make it before dark." 4 miles, Priya said, her voice high and thin. "In this terrain, that'll take hours. And what if it follows us? What if it's waiting along the trail?" "Then we fight," Big Joe's voice said, and everyone turned, their hearts leaping with a mixture of hope and disbelief. But it was not Big Joe. It was only the wind, rustling the leaves in a pattern that sounded almost like speech, a cruel trick of the forest that twisted their desperation into mockery. Elias felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. "We leave the tents," he said. "We take only what we can carry, water, food, first aid, and we move. Now." They packed quickly, their hands shaking, their eyes darting upward to the canopy with every movement. Elias took his journal, his maps, and the small satellite phone that he had kept charged in a Faraday pouch, hoping that they might reach higher ground where the signal could penetrate. The others took water bottles, energy bars, flashlights, and knives, small, inadequate weapons that seemed pathetic in the face of what they were facing. When they were ready, they formed a tight knot in the center of the clearing, their shoulders touching, their breathing synchronized in ragged gasps. "Stay close," Elias said. "Don't run ahead, don't fall behind. If you see anything in the trees, anything at all, you shout. You shout until your throat bleeds." They moved out, following the stream toward the trailhead, their feet finding the path that they had trodden over the past 2 weeks with a confidence that now seemed like arrogance. The forest pressed in around them, the trees looming overhead like the pillars of a cathedral, their branches interlocking to form a roof that blocked out the sky. The light was dim, filtered through layers of leaves, casting everything in shades of green and brown and gray. And the silence was absolute, a suffocating absence of sound that suggested that every living thing in the forest had gone quiet, had hidden itself away, had left the stage for the main actor. Elias walked at the front, his eyes scanning the canopy, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had spent years searching for the Sliver Cat, had dreamed of this moment, had imagined the triumph of discovery, the vindication of his theories. But now that the creature was real, now that it was hunting him, he felt none of the elation he had expected. Only fear, pure and cold and absolute. They had walked for perhaps half a mile when they found the first marker. It was embedded in the trunk of a massive oak, a disk of bone-white material that was smooth and polished, as if it had been sanded and varnished. It was about the size of a dinner plate, and it was set into the bark at eye level facing the trail. Elias stopped, his hand raised in a signal for the others to halt, and he approached the marker with a cautious step. "What is it?" Marcus whispered, his camera forgotten, his eyes wide. "I don't know," Elias said, reaching out to touch the disc. It was warm, warmer than the surrounding bark, and it had a texture that was both smooth and porous like bone or ivory. But I've seen descriptions of these in the old journals. The frontiersmen called them signs or wards. They believed the Sliver Cats used them to mark their territory. "Territory," Priya said, her voice trembling. "You mean, we're in its territory?" "We've been in its territory since we set up camp," Elias said, his voice grim. "We just didn't know it." They moved on, their pace slower now, their eyes scanning the trees for more markers. They found them at regular intervals, each one identical to the last. Bone-white discs embedded in the trunks of ancient trees, facing the trail, marking the boundaries of the Sliver Cat's domain. And between the markers they found other signs. Swathes of bark stripped away in vertical lines, the exposed wood beneath pale and smooth, as if it had been planed by a carpenter. "Scratch marks, Doctor," Okonkwo said, her veterinary expertise taking over despite her fear. "Large predators mark territory by scratching trees, but these are too precise, too regular. This isn't random scratching. This is deliberate. This is a message." "What kind of message?" Tyler asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "A warning," Elias said. "Or an invitation, I'm not sure which is worse." They pressed on, the trail winding through the forest, the canopy growing thicker, the light growing dimmer. Elias checked his watch and saw that it was already mid-afternoon, the sun beginning its descent toward the western peaks. They had perhaps 3 hours of daylight left, maybe 4 if they were lucky, and they were still miles from the trailhead. The forest was changing around them, the trees growing larger, older, their trunks wider than cars, their roots forming massive buttresses that rose from the ground like the walls of a fortress. The undergrowth thinned, the lack of sunlight preventing the dense shrubbery that characterized the lower elevations, and the forest floor became a carpet of decaying leaves and fallen branches, soft and treacherous underfoot. And everywhere, Elias felt the presence of the creature, a weight upon his consciousness that was not quite visible but was undeniably real. It was watching them. He knew it with a certainty that went beyond intuition, beyond reason, beyond the evidence of his senses. It was up there in the canopy, moving silently through the branches, tracking their progress with eyes that saw in dimensions that humans could not perceive. It was patient. It was cunning and it was hungry. "Elias," Priya whispered, her hand clutching his arm. "Do you feel that?" "Feel what?" Elias asked, though he knew what she meant. "The silence, it's wrong. There should be birds, insects, something, but there's nothing, just waiting." She was right. The forest had gone completely quiet, the normal sounds of wildlife replaced by a stillness that was profound and terrifying. Even the wind had died, the leaves hanging motionless on their branches, the air growing heavy and oppressive. It was the silence of a predator's approach, the moment before the strike when everything holds its breath. "Keep moving," Elias said, his voice hoarse. "Don't stop, don't look up, just keep moving." But even as he spoke, he heard it. A sound from above, a rustling in the canopy that was too heavy to be a bird, too fluid to be a squirrel. It was the sound of something large moving through the branches, something that did not climb but glided, using its tail as a fifth limb to anchor itself, to propel itself, to hunt. Elias looked up, his neck craning backward, his eyes searching the dense weave of leaves and branches, and for a moment, just a moment, he saw it. A flash of movement, a blur of tawny fur and bone-white spikes, a tail that whipped through the foliage with a speed that was inhuman. And then it was gone, vanished into the green, leaving only the memory of its passage and the certainty that it was still there, still watching, still waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "Run," Elias said, his voice barely audible. "Run." They ran until their lungs burned and their legs turned to jelly, and then they ran some more, pushing through the undergrowth with a desperation that bordered on madness. The forest floor was treacherous, roots and rocks and fallen branches conspiring to trip them at every step, and more than once one of them stumbled, only to be pulled up by the others and propelled forward by the whip-crack of terror. Elias ran at the front, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts that fought for dominance. The need to survive, the need to understand, the need to document. Even in the midst of his terror, some part of him, the academic part, the obsessive part, was cataloging details, storing observations for later analysis. If there was a later, if any of them survived to tell the tale. Behind him he could hear the others, Marcus gasping, his expensive camera rig abandoned somewhere in the undergrowth. Priya sobbing, her scientific rationalism shattered by the reality of the hunt. The Chen twins running in lockstep, their identical faces masks of identical terror. Dr. Okonkwo muttering under her breath, some veterinary prayer or curse. And Tyler, the youngest, bringing up the rear, his breath coming in ragged whoops that sounded almost like laughter, hysteria taking hold. They ran for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, time dilating in the furnace of fear, until they burst into a clearing and stumbled to a halt, their bodies heaving, their hands on their knees, their faces streaming with sweat and tears. The clearing was familiar, too familiar. It was their campsite. They had run in a circle driven by panic and had ended up exactly where they had started. "No," Marcus groaned, his face twisting with despair. "No, no, no, we were heading for the trailhead. We were going the right way. How did we end up back here?" "It herded us," Elias said, his voice flat and hollow. "The Sliver Cat doesn't just hunt, it coordinates. It drives prey where it wants them to go. We thought we were running away, but we were running exactly where it wanted us." The implications of this statement settled upon the group like a shroud, and for a long moment no one spoke. The clearing looked different now than it had when they had left it an hour ago. The tents were still there, the cooking fire still smoldering, the equipment still scattered about. But the atmosphere had changed. The space transformed from a place of refuge into a trap, a killing floor surrounded by walls of green that seemed to lean inward, to press down upon them with a weight that was almost physical. And the canopy was wrong. It was thicker than before, the branches having woven themselves together into a dense mat that blocked out the sky completely, turning the clearing into a pit of shadow and fear. "We can't stay here," Priya said, her voice cracking. "We have to keep moving, we have to find another way out." "There is no other way out," Elias said. "The trail is the only path through this part of the forest. Everything else is impassable. If we try to bushwhack, we'll just get lost or trapped or worse." "Then what do we do?" Tyler shrieked, his composure finally shattering. "We just sit here and wait to die. We let that thing pick us off one by one." "We arm ourselves," Dr. Okonkwo said, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. "We use what we have. Knives, axes, cooking implements. We build a fire, keep it burning, and we stay in the center of the clearing where we can see everything. If it comes from the trees, we fight." "Fight," Marcus laughed, a broken sound that was more sob than humor. "Fight what? A creature that can drag a 200-pound man into the canopy in seconds. A thing that moves through the trees like a ghost. How exactly do you propose we fight that?" "With fire," Elias said suddenly, an idea forming in his mind. The journals mentioned that the frontiersmen used fire to drive the Sliver Cats away. They're canopy predators. They rely on the trees for mobility, for cover, for their hunting strategy. If we take away the trees, if we burn the canopy— "Burn the forest," Priya said, her eyes wide. "Are you insane? This is a protected wilderness area. We'd go to prison. And besides, the fire would kill us too. We'd be trapped in the middle of a forest fire with no way out. Better than being eaten one by one, Elias said, his voice hard. Better than being dragged into the trees and devoured while we're still alive. The debate was cut short by a sound from above, a rustling in the canopy that was louder, closer, more deliberate than before. Everyone froze, their eyes tracking upward, their bodies tensing like animals scenting danger. The sound moved, circling the clearing, passing from tree to tree with a fluidity that was hypnotic in its grace. It was the Sliver Cat, or one of them. Elias was beginning to suspect that there might be more than one, that they were dealing with a family group or a pride, and it was patrolling the perimeter of its trap, checking the walls, ensuring that the prey could not escape. "Get in the center," Elias hissed, grabbing Tyler and pulling him toward the middle of the clearing. Everyone close together. Back to back, watch the trees, all of them. They formed a tight circle in the center of the clearing, their shoulders touching, their eyes scanning the canopy in all directions. The rustling continued, moving faster now, the creature completing its circuit and beginning another, establishing the boundaries of its territory with a thoroughness that was almost bureaucratic. And then it stopped. The sound ceased, the rustling fading to silence, and the forest held its breath. For a long moment nothing happened. The silence was absolute, broken only by the ragged breathing of the humans and the soft crackle of the smoldering fire. Then, with a sound like a thunderclap, the attack came. It happened so fast that later, when Elias tried to reconstruct the sequence of events, he found that his memory had become a blur of impressions, a fragmented series of images that refused to cohere into a narrative. He heard a crack, a sound like a tree limb breaking, and then David Chen was gone. One moment he was standing to Elias' left, his face pale but his eyes alert, and the next he was simply not there, a space of empty air where a man had been standing. It took Elias a full second to process what had happened, to look upward and see the body being hauled into the canopy by a tail that had whipped down like a lightning bolt, the spiked end having hooked into David's chest with a precision that was surgical in its brutality. The tail retracted with terrifying speed, yanking David upward, and his scream, a high, piercing sound that was cut short as the breath was crushed from his lungs, echoed through the clearing before being swallowed by the leaves. "David!" Daniel Chen screamed, his twin's name tearing from his throat in a sound of pure agony. He lunged forward, his hands reaching upward as if he could somehow pull his brother back from the canopy, but there was nothing to grab, nothing to fight, only the empty air and the fading sound of dragging. Elias grabbed Daniel, wrapping his arms around the younger man's chest and pulling him back toward the center of the circle. "Don't!" Elias shouted. "You'll be next. Stay together, stay in the center." But Daniel was beyond reason, beyond listening, his body convulsing with grief and rage. He broke free of Elias' grip and ran toward the tree where his brother had been taken, his fists raised, his face contorted with a fury that was born of helplessness. He reached the tree and began to pound against the trunk with his bare hands, his knuckles splitting, blood streaming down his wrists, his voice rising in a scream of denial. "Give him back! Give him back, you son of a bitch! Give me back my brother!" The response was instantaneous. A blur of motion from above, a flash of tawny fur and bone-white spikes, and then Daniel was gone too, snatched from the base of the tree by a tail that moved faster than the eye could follow. His scream was shorter than his brother's, cut off by the impact of the hook against his skull, and Elias watched in numb horror as Daniel's body was dragged upward, his limbs flopping like a doll's, his blood raining down in a fine mist that pattered against the leaves and the ground and the faces of the survivors. Two of them gone. In less than a minute, the Sliver Cat or cats had taken two of the strongest, healthiest members of the group with an ease that was terrifying in its casualness, as if they were not human beings but rabbits, not prey to be feared but food to be harvested. The remaining five, Elias, Marcus, Priya, Dr. Okonkwo and Tyler, stood in the center of the clearing, their bodies pressed together, their eyes wide and unblinking, their minds struggling to process the reality of what had just happened. "We're going to die," Tyler whispered, his voice hollow. "We're all going to die here." "Not if I can help it," Elias said, his voice returning with a strength that surprised him. "The fire. We need to build the fire. Now." They scrambled to the smoldering cookfire, feeding it with kindling and dry leaves, fanning the flames until they began to rise, licking at the lower branches of the surrounding trees. The fire grew, crackling and popping, sending sparks upward into the canopy, and Elias felt a faint surge of hope. The Sliver Cats relied on the trees. They hunted from above. If the fire could drive them up, force them to retreat to the highest boughs, then the survivors might have a chance to escape, to run for the trailhead while the creatures were occupied with avoiding the flames. But the fire was slow to spread, the wood damp from recent rains, and the canopy was too high, too thick, the flames unable to reach the branches where the predators lurked. And the Sliver Cats seemed to know this. They moved above the clearing, their presence indicated by the rustling of leaves and the occasional flash of tawny fur, but they did not retreat. They circled, they watched, and they waited. "It's not working," Priya said, her voice rising in panic. "The fire's not reaching them. They're just waiting for us to burn ourselves out." "Then we need to go," Dr. Okonkwo said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We need to make a break for it right now while they're distracted." "Go where?" Marcus asked. "The trail is blocked. We tried to follow it and ended up back here, and the forest is too dense to push through." "Then we follow the stream," Elias said, pointing toward the water that flowed at the edge of the clearing. "The stream will lead us to lower ground, to the valley. The Sliver Cats are canopy predators. They need the trees. If we can reach the riverbed where the trees are sparse and the rocks are exposed, we'll be safer." "Safer?" Tyler laughed, the hysteria back in his voice. "We'll be safer. Nothing is safe here. Nothing." "It's our only chance," Elias said, his voice hard. "We move in a tight formation, we use our packs as shields over our heads, and we run. We run until we reach the river, and then we follow it down to the valley. If we make it to the road, we flag down a car, we get to a town, we call for help." "And if we don't make it?" Priya asked. Elias met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw the answer. If they didn't make it, they would die. Simple as that. They gathered their remaining supplies, filling their packs with water and food and anything else that might be useful. They found Big Joe's hunting knife in his tent, a massive blade that was more machete than knife, and Elias took it, feeling the weight of it in his hand, the solid reassurance of cold steel. They positioned themselves at the edge of the clearing, facing the direction of the stream, and they formed a tight wedge, their bodies closed together, their packs raised above their heads to protect against attacks from above. "On three," Elias said, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire and the rustling canopy. 1, 2, 3. They ran. They burst from the clearing like a single organism, their feet pounding against the forest floor, their arms pumping, their lungs burning. The stream was close, perhaps 50 yards, but those 50 yards seemed like 50 miles, an endless gauntlet of terror that stretched before them like a nightmare. Above them, the canopy exploded with movement, the Sliver Cats reacting to the escape attempt with a speed that was terrifying. Elias heard the whip-crack of a tail, felt the wind of its passage against his cheek, and ducked instinctively, the spike passing within inches of his skull. He stumbled, almost fell, but Priya grabbed his arm and pulled him forward, and they kept running. They reached the stream and splashed into the water, the cold shock of it against their legs making them gasp, but also galvanizing them, the primitive instinct for survival overriding the paralysis of fear. They ran along the streambed, their feet slipping on the smooth stones, their progress slowed by the uneven terrain but their spirits lifted by the sight of the sky above, visible through gaps in the canopy where the water had prevented the trees from growing too thick. "Keep going," Elias shouted, his voice hoarse. "Don't stop, don't look back." But Marcus did look back. He couldn't help himself. He turned his head, his eyes tracking upward to the canopy, and what he saw made him stumble, his feet catching on a submerged rock, his body pitching forward into the water. Elias heard the splash, heard Marcus's cry of surprise, and he turned to see the man floundering in the shallow stream, his pack floating away downstream, his face twisted with pain. "My ankle," Marcus gasped. "I twisted my ankle. I can't." The sentence was cut short by a sound like a rifle shot, a crack that echoed through the forest and made every bird for miles take flight. The Sliver Cat's tail, the rounded side this time, struck Marcus square in the back with a force that drove the air from his lungs and sent him sprawling face first into the water. Before anyone could react, before anyone could even process what had happened, the tail whipped around, the spiked end hooking into Marcus's ribs with a sickening crunch that Elias heard even over the sound of the stream, and Marcus was yanked vertically into the canopy with a speed that was shocking in its efficiency. One moment he was in the water, thrashing and gasping, and the next he was gone, only a few drifting leaves and a ripple in the stream marking the place where he had been. Elias stood frozen, his hand still outstretched as if he could somehow pull Marcus back, and he watched as a single, blood-streaked branch vibrated from the force of the pull, its leaves trembling as if in a wind that only they could feel. Then the branch stilled and Marcus was gone and the forest was silent again. "Marcus!" Priya screamed, but her voice was lost in the silence, absorbed by the trees and the water and the indifferent sky. "Oh God, Marcus! Keep moving!" Elias shouted, grabbing Priya's arm and dragging her forward. "Don't stop! It'll come back. It always comes back." They ran, the four of them now, their numbers halved in a matter of minutes, their hope fading with each step. The stream grew wider as they descended, its banks becoming steeper, the canopy above thinning slightly but still dense enough to provide cover for the predators. They ran until their bodies screamed for rest, until their lungs felt like they were filled with fire, until their legs threatened to buckle beneath them. And then they stopped, not because they wanted to, but because the terrain had changed. The stream had reached a junction with a larger waterway, a river that flowed through a narrow gorge, its banks rising in steep cliffs of rock and earth. And across the river, connected to their side by a narrow land bridge of fallen trees, was the opposite bank, where the forest was thinner and the ground was flatter and the promise of escape seemed almost tangible. "There," Elias gasped, pointing to the land bridge. "We cross there. The other side is more open. We can see them coming." But the land bridge was exposed, a tangle of fallen trunks and branches that spanned the river with a precariousness that was terrifying. It was perhaps 30 feet long, and it offered no cover, no protection, no defense against an attack from above. To cross it would be to make themselves completely vulnerable, to offer themselves to the canopy like a platter of meat. "We can't," Tyler whimpered, his face white with exhaustion and fear. "We'll be sitting ducks out there. They'll pick us off one by one." "We don't have a choice," Dr. Okonkwo said, her voice firm. "The streambed is a trap. We need to get to the other side, to the road to civilization. And this is the only way." They approached the land bridge with a caution that was almost painful, their eyes scanning the canopy, their bodies tensed for the attack that they knew was coming. The bridge was a tangle of oak and maple, the trunks slick with moss and water, the branches interwoven into a precarious lattice that shifted and creaked with every step. Elias went first, testing each step before committing his weight, his hands reaching for handholds among the branches. The others followed, Priya behind him, then Dr. Okonkwo, then Tyler, each of them moving with the slow, deliberate care of people who knew that a single misstep could send them plunging into the river below. They were halfway across when the attack came. It was not a single strike but a barrage, the Sliver Cats, for there were definitely more than one now. Elias could see them moving in the canopy above, at least 3, maybe 4, coordinating their assault with a precision that was almost military. The first tail struck the bridge near its center, the rounded side slamming into the trunk with a force that made the entire structure shudder. Elias clung to the branches, his knuckles white, his heart hammering. The second tail struck near the far end, and Elias heard a crack as one of the supporting trunks began to split. "Hurry!" he screamed. "Hurry! It's coming down!" They scrambled forward, their caution abandoned, their bodies moving with a desperation that was primal. Priya was ahead of Elias, almost at the far bank, when a tail whipped down from above, the spiked end grazing her shoulder and tearing a strip of flesh from her arm. She screamed, a high, piercing sound, and she fell, her body sliding between the trunks, her hands clutching at branches that broke under her weight. Elias lunged forward, his hand closing around her wrist, and he hauled her upward with a strength that was born of adrenaline and terror. He pulled her onto the bridge, and they crawled the remaining distance to the far bank, collapsing on the rocky shore, their bodies shaking, their breath coming in ragged gasps. "Doctor." Okonkwo made it across next, her face set in a mask of grim determination, her eyes fixed on the canopy above. She reached the bank and scrambled up the rocks, her hands bleeding from the effort. But Tyler was still on the bridge, frozen in the middle, his body paralyzed by fear, his eyes wide and unblinking as he stared up at the canopy. "Tyler!" Elias screamed. "Move, move your ass!" But Tyler did not move. He stood there, trembling, his mouth open in a silent scream, as a Sliver Cat descended from the canopy above him. It was the first time Elias had seen one of the creatures in full light, and the sight was enough to freeze his blood. The Sliver Cat was massive, larger than any lion or tiger, its body perhaps 300 pounds of corded muscle and sinew. Its fur was the color of dead leaves, a mottled pattern of brown and gold and gray that blended perfectly with the canopy. But it was the tail that commanded attention, the 11-foot appendage that writhed and coiled like a living thing, ending in a cluster of bone-white spikes that gleamed with a wet, organic luster. The creature's face was feline but wrong, the proportions stretched and distorted, the eyes horizontal slits of red that burned with an intelligence that was almost human. And its mouth, when it opened, revealed not the simple dentition of a cat but rows of needle-like teeth, each one curved backward like a fishhook, designed to hold and tear. The Sliver Cat landed on the bridge beside Tyler, its weight making the structure groan, and it looked at the boy with an expression that might have been curiosity, might have been hunger. Tyler whimpered, a sound that was barely human, and he raised his hands in a gesture of futile defense. The Sliver Cat struck. Not with its tail, but with its claws, a single swipe that opened Tyler's chest from sternum to navel, the blood spraying outward in an arc that caught the creature's fur and turned it dark. Tyler fell, his body tumbling from the bridge, his scream cut short by the impact of the water below. The Sliver Cat watched him fall, its head tilting in a gesture that was almost thoughtful, and then it turned its red eyes toward the bank where Elias, Priya, and Dr. Okonkwo crouched, and it smiled. It actually smiled, its lips peeling back from those terrible teeth in an expression that was so human, so knowing, that Elias felt his sanity teeter on the edge of collapse. Then the creature leaped, not toward them but back into the canopy, vanishing into the leaves with a fluidity that was hypnotic. And from above, from the depths of the canopy, came the sound of feeding, the wet tearing and crunching that told Elias that Tyler's body had been retrieved from the river and was being consumed, not as a meal but as a trophy, a prize for the creature that had proven its dominance. "We have to keep moving," Dr. Okonkwo said, her voice rough but steady. "We can't stop, we can't mourn, we have to survive." Elias nodded, though his body felt like lead, his spirit crushed by the weight of the deaths he had witnessed. 3 of them gone, maybe 4 if Tyler had not died instantly in the water. 7 had entered the forest. 3 remained, and the Sliver Cats were still hunting. They moved along the riverbank with a desperation that had transcended fear, entering a state of pure survival instinct where thought was replaced by action, where every step was a victory, every breath a defiance. The river had carved a gorge through the ancient rock, its walls rising steeply on either side, the forest above thinning to a fringe of trees that clung to the cliffs with root systems that seemed more like claws than botanical structures. The canopy here was less dense, the gaps between the trees wider, and Elias allowed himself a faint spark of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the sliver cats would be less effective in this terrain, their hunting strategy compromised by the lack of cover. But the hope was fragile, and it shattered with a sound from above that made his blood run cold. It was a cry, but not the cry of a bird or an animal. It was human, or had been human once, a sound of such pure, distilled agony that it seemed to resonate in Elias' bones, vibrating through his skull and settling in the pit of his stomach like a stone. He looked up, his neck craning backward, his eyes searching the cliff face above, and what he saw made him stumble, his feet catching on a rock, his body pitching forward onto the rough ground. The cliff was pocked with ledges and crevices, natural shelves that had been formed by millennia of erosion, and on one of these shelves, perhaps 50 feet above the river, was a structure. It was a nest, or something like a nest, a woven tangle of branches and vines and bones that sprawled across the ledge with an organic complexity that suggested both natural formation and deliberate construction. And in the nest, held in place by more branches and what looked like dried tendons, were bodies, human bodies. Elias could see at least 3 from where he stood, though there might have been more hidden in the tangle. They were suspended at various angles, some upright, some horizontal, their limbs arranged in poses that were grotesque in their casualness. And they were alive. That was the most terrible thing. They were not dead, not yet. Elias could see movement, could hear the faint, whimpering sounds that emerged from throats too damaged to scream properly. The sliver cats did not kill their prey immediately. The old journals had hinted at this, had spoken of roosts where the creatures stored their food, keeping it alive for days, sometimes weeks, consuming it slowly, piece by piece, in a feeding strategy that was as cruel as it was efficient. The bodies in the nest were the remains of previous victims, hikers and hunters and wanderers who had strayed into the sliver cat's territory and had been taken, not to be killed outright but to be stored, to be kept fresh, to be consumed at leisure. And Elias realized with a horror that went beyond anything he had yet experienced that this was the fate that awaited him and Priya and Dr. Okonkwo if they were caught. They would not die quickly. They would be dragged to a ledge like this one, suspended in a nest of branches and bones, and they would be eaten alive piece by piece, while the sliver cats purred and groomed and watched with their red, patient eyes. "Don't look," Dr. Okonkwo said, her hand on Elias' shoulder, her voice rough with compassion and her own fear. "Don't look up. Keep your eyes on the path. We have to keep moving." But Elias could not look away. His eyes were drawn to the nest, to the bodies, to the suffering that was being inflicted upon people who had been unlucky enough to walk these woods at the wrong time. He saw a man, or what had been a man, his chest opened in a way that suggested the sliver cats had begun with the organs, the softest parts, the parts that yielded the most nutrition. The man's head was lolling to one side, his eyes open but unfocused, his mouth moving in a soundless prayer or curse. And next to him, a woman, her legs stripped of flesh to reveal the white bone beneath, her face contorted in an expression of agony that seemed to have been frozen there for days. The sliver cats were not mere predators. They were artisans of suffering, connoisseurs of pain, and their roosts were galleries where they displayed their work with a pride that was almost human. "Elias," Priya screamed, her voice cutting through the fog of his horror. "Elias, move, it's coming." He tore his eyes from the nest, his mind snapping back to the present with a force that was almost physical, and he saw it. A sliver cat was descending the cliff face, moving not along the ledges but directly down the rock, its claws finding purchase in microscopic cracks and crevices with a precision that was impossible. Its tail, that impossible tail, was wrapped around a projecting branch above, anchoring it, allowing it to descend with a control that was hypnotic in its grace. The creature's red eyes were fixed upon them, and its mouth was open, the needle teeth gleaming, a low rumbling purr emerging from its throat that was almost loud enough to drown out the river. "Run!" Elias screamed, but even as he spoke, he knew that running was futile. The creature was between them and the path forward, and behind them the river flowed deep and fast, its current strong enough to sweep them away if they tried to swim. They were trapped, pinned against the cliff with no escape, no cover, no hope. The Sliver Cat reached the ground, its body moving with a fluidity that was alien, its muscles rippling beneath the mottled fur, its tail uncoiling from the branch and dropping to the ground behind it like a serpent. It was larger than the one Elias had seen before, or perhaps it was the same one, and his perception was distorted by adrenaline and terror. It advanced slowly, deliberately, its claws clicking against the rocks, its purr rising in volume until it seemed to fill the gorge, to bounce off the walls and return amplified, a sound that was felt in the chest rather than heard by the ears. "We need fire," Dr. Okonkwo whispered, her eyes fixed on the creature. "The journal said fire drives them back. We need to light something, anything." "With what?" Priya gasped, her body pressed against the cliff, her hands clawing at the rock as if she could somehow dig her way through. "All our matches are wet." Elias' hand went to his pocket, and he felt the familiar shape of the satellite phone in its Faraday pouch. The pouch was waterproof, and inside, along with the phone, was a small emergency kit, a flint, a few matches in a waterproof container, and a length of magnesium ribbon that could be ignited with a spark. He had forgotten about it in the panic, but now he pulled it out, his fingers trembling, and he opened the container. "I have matches," he said, his voice barely audible above the purring. "I have magnesium, but we need something to burn, something that will make a big flame fast." "Our clothes," Priya said immediately. "We can use our jackets. They're synthetic. They'll burn hot and fast." "And the branches," Dr. Okonkwo added, pointing to a pile of driftwood that had accumulated at the base of the cliff. "Dry wood. It'll catch if we can get a spark." The Sliver Cat was almost upon them now, perhaps 20 feet away, its tail raised and coiled like a scorpion's stinger, the bone-white spikes gleaming. It paused, its head tilting in a gesture that was almost feline curiosity, and it looked at them with eyes that seemed to hold an intelligence that was ancient and patient and utterly alien. "Hurry," Elias whispered, his hands shaking as he struck the flint against the magnesium. The first spark failed. The second caught on the magnesium ribbon and flared into a brilliant white flame that was almost blinding. He touched it to the pile of clothes and driftwood that Priya and Dr. Okonkwo had gathered, and the flame caught, spreading with a speed that was startling, the synthetic material of the jackets melting and burning with a thick black smoke. The Sliver Cat recoiled, its tail lashing, its purr changing to a sound that was almost a hiss, a note of displeasure that suggested the fire was anathema to it. It backed away, its eyes narrowing, its claws scoring the rock with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. "It's working," Priya cried, her voice rising with a hope that was almost painful in its intensity. "It's backing off, keep the fire going, add more wood." They fed the fire, throwing everything they could find into the flames. Clothes, branches, their packs, even Elias' precious journal, the pages curling and blackening, the words of Jedediah Crow turning to ash. The fire grew, rising in a column of flame and smoke that reached toward the canopy, and the Sliver Cat retreated further, its body tensing, its tail whipping with agitation. But it did not flee. It circled, staying just beyond the reach of the flames, its eyes fixed upon them with a predatory patience that suggested it was willing to wait. And from above, from the roost and the cliff and the canopy beyond, came answering calls, the low rumbling purrs of other Sliver Cats, drawn by the smoke and the commotion. "There's more of them," Dr. Okonkwo said, her face pale in the firelight. "The fire is keeping this one back, but it's attracting the others. We can't stay here." "We need to get higher," Elias said, an idea forming in his mind. "The ledge, the roost. If we can reach it, we can set fire to the nest. The whole cliff face will burn. The Sliver Cats will have to retreat." "You're insane," Priya said, her eyes wide. "That nest is full of people, living people. We can't burn them alive." "They're already dead," Elias said, his voice hard, "or as good as dead, and if we don't do something, we'll join them. The fire is our only chance. We have to take it." He did not wait for agreement. He turned to the cliff face and began to climb, his hands finding holds in the rock, his feet pushing against projections that were barely large enough to support his weight. The climb was treacherous, the rock slick with moisture and algae, the holds few and far between. But adrenaline and desperation lent him strength, and he ascended with a speed that surprised him, his body moving with a grace that was almost automatic. Priya and Dr. Okonkwo followed, their faces set in masks of grim determination, their hands and feet finding the same holds that Elias had used. The Sliver Cat below watched them climb, its tail lashing, its purr rising to a pitch that suggested frustration, anger. But it did not follow. The fire still burned at the base of the cliff, and the creature was reluctant to pass through the flames. It was a canopy predator, adapted to life in the trees, not on the ground, and the fire represented a threat that its instincts could not overcome. But as Elias climbed higher, he saw movement in the canopy above, other shapes moving through the branches, converging on the cliff face. The other Sliver Cats were coming, drawn by the disturbance, and they would not be deterred by the fire at the base. They would attack from above, from the sides, from any angle that offered an opportunity. Elias reached the ledge, his fingers clawing at the edge, his muscles screaming, and he hauled himself over, collapsing on the rough surface, his chest heaving. The nest was beside him, close enough to touch, and the smell that emanated from it was overpowering. The smell of decay and blood and human waste, the smell of a slaughterhouse that had been left in the sun. The bodies were worse up close, their injuries magnified by proximity, their suffering impossible to ignore. One of them, a young man who could not have been older than Tyler, turned his head toward Elias, his eyes focusing with an effort that seemed to drain the last of his strength, and he whispered a single word, "Please." Elias felt tears streaming down his face, mixing with the sweat and the dirt, and he reached out to touch the young man's hand, feeling the coldness of the skin, the weakness of the grip. "I'm sorry," Elias whispered. "I'm so sorry." Then he pulled away and turned to the nest itself, his hands finding the dry branches, the brittle vines, the tinder that had been accumulated over months or years of construction. Priya and Dr. Okonkwo pulled themselves onto the ledge, their faces gray with exhaustion, and they saw what Elias was doing. "No," Priya gasped. "Elias, no, we can't." "We have to," Elias said, his voice breaking. "It's the only way. The fire will spread to the canopy. The Sliver Cats will retreat. And maybe it'll be quick for them, kinder than what's coming." He struck the flint again, the spark catching on the dry material of the nest, and the flame spread with terrifying speed. The branches were old and desiccated, the vines as dry as paper, and within seconds the entire nest was ablaze, the flames rising in a column that reached toward the canopy above. The heat was intense, forcing Elias, Priya, and Dr. Okonkwo to retreat to the edge of the ledge, their faces blistered, their eyes streaming. And from within the inferno there came sounds. The popping of sap in the branches, the crackle of burning bone, and beneath it, mercifully brief, the screams of the dying. Elias closed his eyes, his hands pressed against his ears, his body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from a place deeper than his chest, deeper than his gut, from the very core of his being. He had killed them. He had killed the people in the nest, the survivors, the victims who had clung to life in the hope of rescue. He had burned them alive to save himself, and the weight of that act would crush him for the rest of his life, however long that life might be. The fire spread upward, as Elias had hoped, catching the lower branches of the canopy and spreading from tree to tree with a speed that was aided by the dry season and the dense undergrowth. The Sliver Cat screamed, a sound that was not feline but something else, something that spoke of rage and pain and a territorial instinct that was being violated. They retreated upward, climbing higher into the trees, moving away from the flames that were consuming their roost, their hunting ground, their home. The gorge became an inferno, the walls of rock reflecting the heat back upon the fugitives, the air growing thick with smoke and ash. "We have to jump," Dr. Okonkwo shouted, her voice barely audible above the roar of the flames. "The ledge is going to collapse. We have to get down to the river." Elias looked over the edge. The drop was 50 feet, maybe more, into water that was deep and fast and filled with rocks. A fall from this height would break bones, would drown the weak, would kill the unlucky. But staying on the ledge meant burning alive, and the choice was no choice at all. Together, Elias said, reaching for Priya's hand and Dr. Okonkwo's hand, linking them in a chain. On three, 1, 2, 3, they jumped. The fall lasted an eternity, the air rushing past them, the flames above shrinking to a distant glow, the water below rising to meet them with a terrible inevitability. They hit the surface with a force that drove the air from their lungs, the cold shock of the water paralyzing them for a moment before the current seized them and swept them downstream. Elias tumbled, his body battered by rocks and branches, his mouth filling with water that tasted of ash and blood. He fought for the surface, his arms flailing, his legs kicking, and he broke through into air that was thick with smoke but still breathable. He gasped, his lungs burning, and he looked around for the others. Priya was nearby, her head above the water, her arms swimming weakly. Dr. Okonkwo was further downstream, clinging to a rock that projected from the surface, her face pale but alive. The current swept them along, carrying them away from the burning gorge, away from the roost, away from the Sliver Cats and their endless hunger. They drifted for what felt like hours, their bodies numb with cold, their minds blank with shock. The river widened as it descended, its current slowing, its banks becoming less steep. The canopy above thinned, the trees giving way to brush and then to open meadow, and Elias felt a faint stir of hope. They were leaving the high country, the Sliver Cat's territory. They were reaching the edge of the forest, the boundary of the wilderness. And somewhere ahead, he knew, was a road. A paved road with cars and people and the mundane safety of civilization. They reached the riverbank at a place where the water was shallow and the current was gentle, and they dragged themselves onto the shore, collapsing on the grass, their bodies shaking with cold and exhaustion. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and orange and gold, and Elias lay on his back, staring upward, watching the first stars emerge in the darkening blue. He had never thought he would see the stars again. He had never thought he would feel grass beneath his back, or smell the clean air of the valley, or hear the distant sound of a car engine. But here he was, alive, improbably, impossibly alive. Priya crawled over to him, her face streaked with dirt and ash, her eyes hollow with the things she had seen. "We made it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We actually made it." "Some of us did," Elias said, and the weight of those who had not made it settled upon him like a stone. Big Joe, Marcus, the Chen twins, Tyler. 5 lives lost to his obsession, to his need to prove the existence of a creature that should have remained a legend. The guilt was crushing, overwhelming, a burden that he would carry for the rest of his days. Dr. Okonkwo joined them, her arm hanging at an awkward angle, probably broken, her face covered in bruises and cuts. But she was alive, and she managed a weak smile that was more grimace than expression of joy. "We need to find a road," she said. "We need to get to a hospital, and then we need to tell someone what happened, the authorities, the Forest Service. Someone has to know, someone has to stop people from going in there." "They won't believe us," Elias said, his voice flat. "They'll think we're crazy. They'll think it's a bear attack or a landslide or mass hysteria. No one will believe that there are creatures in those trees that can drag a man into the canopy and keep him alive for weeks while they eat him. Then we'll make them believe," Priya said, her voice suddenly fierce. "We'll show them the photographs, the evidence, She stopped, her face falling. "The camera, Marcus's camera, it's gone. Everything is gone." "It doesn't matter," Dr. Okonkwo said. "We'll testify. We'll describe what we saw. We'll warn people. Even if they don't believe us, even if they laugh, we'll keep telling the truth until someone listens." They helped each other to their feet, their bodies screaming in protest, and they began to walk. The meadow was flat and open, the grass tall and soft, and they moved with a slow, stumbling gait that was part exhaustion and part relief. In the distance, perhaps a mile away, they could see the lights of a road, the occasional flash of headlights that suggested traffic, people, the world beyond the wilderness. They walked toward those lights with a determination that was born of survival, their minds fixed on the simple goal of reaching the road, of flagging down a car, of being taken to safety. They were perhaps halfway across the meadow when Elias heard it. A sound from behind them, from the edge of the forest that they had left. A rustling in the leaves, a snapping of branches, a low, rumbling purr that seemed to carry across the distance with a clarity that was impossible. He stopped, his heart hammering, and he turned to look back. The forest was dark, a wall of black against the fading light of the sunset. But in the topmost bough of a towering oak that stood at the forest's edge, silhouetted against the red sky, was a shape. It was the Sliver Cat, or one of them. It was impossible to tell from this distance, impossible to distinguish one from another. But Elias knew, with a certainty that was beyond doubt, that it was the same creature that had looked at him in the clearing, that had smiled at him with its needle teeth, that had hunted him through the forest with a patience that was older than human civilization. The creature was perched on the highest branch, its body crouched, its tail wrapped around the trunk for balance. Its eyes, those horizontal slits of red, were visible even from here, glowing with a light that was not reflected but emanated, a bioluminescence that spoke of adaptations beyond the understanding of science. And it was watching them, not with hunger, Elias realized, not with the predatory focus of a creature that was about to strike, but with something else: patience. Calculation. The cold, assessing gaze of a creature that knew it had been defeated this time, but that also knew, with the deep wisdom of the wild, that there would be other times, other prey, other opportunities. The Sliver Cat did not roar. It did not charge. It simply sat there, its red eyes fixed upon the three survivors, and it watched them walk away. Elias stood frozen for a long moment, locked in a silent communion with the creature that had nearly killed him, that had killed his friends, that had shown him the true face of the wilderness. And in that communion, he understood something that he had not understood before. The Sliver Cats were not monsters. They were not demons or spirits or supernatural entities. They were animals, predators that had evolved in isolation over millions of years to fill a specific ecological niche. They were the apex predators of the canopy, the rulers of a vertical kingdom that humans had forgotten or never known. And like all apex predators, they were territorial, intelligent, and patient. They would not follow Elias into the valley. They would not leave their territory, their hunting grounds, their roosts, but they would remember him. They would remember the fire, the destruction, the escape. And they would be waiting, always waiting, for the next human foolish enough to venture into their domain. Elias turned away from the forest, from the creature, from the darkness that had nearly consumed him. He helped Priya and Dr. Okonkwo to their feet, and together they walked toward the road, toward the lights, toward the safety of a world that did not know and did not want to know what lurked in the ancient forests of the Appalachians. They reached the road as the last light faded from the sky, and they flagged down a pickup truck driven by an elderly man who took one look at their bedraggled, injured state and immediately called for an ambulance. They were taken to a hospital in the nearest town, where they were treated for hypothermia, burns, broken bones, and shock. The authorities came and they told their story, and as Elias had predicted, they were not believed. The official explanation was a bear attack, a tragic accident in the wilderness, a reminder of the dangers of venturing into primitive areas without proper preparation. The bodies of the missing expedition members were never found, their fates officially listed as presumed deceased due to animal attack. Elias, Priya, and Dr. Okonkwo were released after a few days, their physical wounds healing but their psychological scars permanent. They went their separate ways, Elias returning to his small apartment in Virginia, Priya flying back to India, Dr. Okonkwo moving to a practice in a city far from any forest. They did not keep in touch. The bond that had formed between them in the wilderness was too painful to maintain, a constant reminder of the things they had seen and the people they had lost. Elias tried to return to his research, to his obsession with cryptozoology, but he found that the fire had gone out. He could not look at a tree without seeing the canopy, without imagining the eyes that watched from above. He could not walk in the woods without feeling the weight of the branches pressing down upon him, the sense of being hunted that never fully went away. He gave up his research, sold his books and his equipment, and took a job as a night watchman at a warehouse, a life of simple, safe routines that required no courage and offered no danger. But in his dreams he still saw the Sliver Cat. He saw its red eyes, its needle teeth, its impossible tail. He saw the roost, the bodies, the suffering. And he saw the final image, the one that haunted him most of all, the creature perched on the highest branch, watching him walk away, not with hunger but with patience, with the cold, calculating knowledge that the hunt was never truly over. Years later, Elias would read a news story about a group of hikers who had disappeared in the same stretch of wilderness, their campsite found abandoned, their equipment scattered, no bodies ever recovered. The authorities would blame bears or mountain lions or the harsh terrain. But Elias would know. He would sit in his small apartment, reading the story by the light of a single lamp, and he would look out the window at the trees that grew in the empty lot next door, and he would imagine that he saw movement in the highest branches, a flash of tawny fur, a gleam of red eyes. He would tell himself that it was his imagination, that the Sliver Cats were confined to the Appalachian high country, that they could not possibly be here in the suburbs of Virginia. But he would never be sure. And on the nights when the wind rustled the leaves outside his window, when the branches swayed and creaked with a sound that was almost like breathing, he would lie awake in his bed, his heart hammering, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, waiting for the sound of claws on the roof, the snap of the tail, the wet thump-thump-thump of something heavy being dragged upward into the darkness. And in the ancient forest, in the high canopy where the sun barely reached, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and decay, the Sliver Cats continued their eternal vigil. They hunted, they fed, they waited, and they remembered the man who had escaped them, the man who had burned their roost and taken their prey, the man whose face they would recognize if he ever returned. But they did not need him to return. There were always others, always the curious, the foolish, the brave, the obsessed, always the humans who ventured into the deep woods with their cameras and their notebooks and their arrogant belief that the world was a place of order and reason. The Sliver Cats would be there, patient and eternal, their red eyes burning in the darkness, their tails coiled and ready, their hunger older than human memory. And when the next expedition came, when the next group of seekers pushed through the undergrowth into the high-canopy territory, the cats would be waiting. They would watch. They would calculate. And they would strike, with a speed that was inhuman and a precision that was absolute, dragging their prey upward into the leaves where the sunlight could not reach and the screams could not escape, because the canopy had weight. It pressed down upon the world below, a ceiling of green and shadow that separated the human realm from the realm of the hunters. And beneath that canopy, in the spaces between the branches where the air was still and the light was dim, the Sliver Cats ruled supreme, their dominion unchallenged, their hunger never satisfied, their patience infinite. The forest was their kingdom. The trees were their throne, and the humans who walked beneath them were nothing but food, waiting to be harvested, waiting to be dragged upward into the eternal green, waiting to become part of the canopy's weight, part of the silence, part of the dark. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and flowers, a combination that Elias had come to associate with endings. He lay in the narrow bed, his body wrapped in bandages and connected to machines that beeped and whirred with a mechanical indifference, and he stared at the ceiling with eyes that saw not the acoustic tiles above him, but the canopy of the forest, the weave of branches and leaves that had nearly become his coffin. The doctors had told him that he was lucky. The burns on his hands would heal with minimal scarring. The ribs that had been cracked by his fall into the river would mend in 6 weeks. The hypothermia had been severe but not fatal, thanks to the quick response of the ambulance crew. He was lucky, they said. He had survived, but Elias did not feel lucky. He felt hollowed out, emptied of everything that had once made him who he was. The obsession that had driven him for years, the burning need to prove the existence of the impossible, had been extinguished in the fires of the roost, burned away along with the bodies of his friends and the last shreds of his innocence. He knew now that there were things in the world that were better left unknown, truths that were too terrible to be spoken aloud, realities that could not be captured in photographs or documented in journals. The Sliver Cat was real. He had seen it, had smelled its breath, had looked into its red, patient eyes. And that knowledge was a burden that would crush him slowly over the remaining years of his life, until there was nothing left but the memory of the canopy and the weight of the dead. Priya visited him once on the second day. She stood in the doorway of his room, her face pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, and she looked at him with an expression that was equal parts pity and accusation. "The authorities are calling it a bear attack," she said, her voice flat. "They're not even going to search for the bodies. They say the terrain is too dangerous, the area too remote. They say it's not worth the risk." "They're right," Elias said, his voice barely audible. "It's not worth the risk. Nothing is worth that risk." "We could tell them," Priya said, stepping into the room, her hands clutching her purse as if it were a lifeline. "We could tell them the truth. We could make them listen." "And what would we say?" Elias asked, turning his head to look at her, his eyes hollow. "That we were hunted by giant cats with 11-foot tails and bone hooks, that they dragged our friends into the trees and ate them alive. They would lock us up, Priya. They would say we were crazy, and maybe they would be right. Maybe crazy is the only sane response to what we saw." Priya was silent for a long moment, her face working with emotions that she could not express. Then she nodded once and turned to leave. "I'm going back to India," she said, her back to him. "I'm going to try to forget. I suggest you do the same." She walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the corridor, and Elias knew that he would never see her again. Dr. Okonkwo did not visit. He learned later that she had been transferred to another hospital, closer to her family, and that she had retired from veterinary practice, citing trauma. She moved to a small town in the Midwest, a place with no forests, no trees taller than a lamppost, no canopy to press down upon her with its suffocating weight. She lived quietly, anonymously, until her death 15 years later, her obituary mentioning only that she had been a beloved member of her community, with no reference to the expedition or the horror that had ended her career. Elias was discharged from the hospital after a week, his body healed enough to walk, his mind shattered beyond repair. He returned to his apartment in Virginia, a small, cluttered space that had once been filled with books and maps and equipment, but now seemed like the dwelling of a stranger. He threw away his research, his journals, his notes on the Sliver Cat, watching them burn in a metal barrel behind his building with a sense of finality that was almost religious. He tried to resume his life, to find work, to interact with other human beings. But the world had changed for him, had been stripped of its comforting lies and exposed for what it truly was. A thin veneer of civilization stretched over a wilderness of teeth and claws and patient, hungry eyes. He could not hold a job. He could not maintain relationships. He could not sleep without dreaming of the canopy, of the red eyes watching from above, of the wet thump-thump-thump of something heavy being dragged upward through the leaves. He took to walking at night, when the streets were empty, and the trees cast long shadows that reminded him of the forest. He would walk for hours, his feet carrying him without conscious direction, until he found himself standing at the edge of a park or a wooded lot, staring upward at the branches with a mixture of terror and longing. He knew that the Sliver Cats were not here in the suburbs of Virginia. They were confined to the ancient forests of the Appalachians, to the high canopy where they had evolved and where they ruled. But he also knew, with a certainty that was beyond reason, that they were aware of him, that they remembered him, that the patient eye that had watched him leave the forest was still watching, still waiting, still calculating the distance between them. One night, 5 years after the expedition, Elias found himself standing in a small park near his apartment, a patch of green that had seemed harmless in the daylight, but that had become a maze of shadows and whispers after dark. The trees were oaks and maples, nothing like the ancient giants of the Appalachians, but in the dim light of the street lamps they seemed to loom over him, their branches reaching toward him like grasping fingers. He stood beneath the largest oak, his neck craned backward, his eyes scanning the canopy above. And he saw it. A flash of movement, a blur of tawny fur, a tail that whipped through the branches with a speed that was impossible. It was there for only a moment, a fraction of a second, and then it was gone, vanished into the leaves with a silence that was more terrifying than any sound could have been. Elias stood frozen, his heart hammering, his breath coming in short, white puffs in the cold night air. He told himself that it was his imagination, a trick of the light, a figment of his traumatized mind. But he knew, with the deep wisdom of the hunted, that it was real. The Sliver Cats had followed him. Or perhaps they had always been here, hidden in the canopies of suburban parks, waiting for the one who had escaped them to venture out into the night, to stand beneath a tree, to look up. He ran, his feet pounding against the pavement, his body driven by a terror that was primal and absolute. He did not look back. He could not. He ran until he reached his apartment, until he had locked the door and thrown the bolt and leaned against the wood, gasping, his body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest. He never went outside at night again. He kept his blinds drawn, his lights on, his doors locked and barred. He lived in a fortress of light and steel, a prison of his own making, safe from the canopy but trapped within his own fear. He died alone 12 years after the expedition, his body found by a landlord who had come to collect the rent. The official cause of death was heart failure, though the medical examiner noted the extreme emaciation and the signs of prolonged psychological trauma. Among his effects, they found a single item that puzzled them: a photograph, or what had been a photograph before it had been burned and partially destroyed. It showed a pair of leather hiking boots, suspended in midair, with a jagged piece of bone piercing through the ankle, and written on the back in a hand that was barely legible were 2 words: the canopy. The photograph was filed away in a box of personal effects and eventually discarded, and Elias' story was forgotten, reduced to a footnote in the annals of crypto-zoological disasters, a cautionary tale told to young enthusiasts who dreamed of discovering the impossible. But in the ancient forest, in the high canopy where the sun barely reached and the air was thick with the scent of pine and decay, the Sliver Cats continued their vigil. They bred, they hunted, they waited. And in the topmost bough of a towering oak, a single red eye watched the road below, patient and eternal, waiting for the next human to venture into the trees, waiting for the next meal to walk beneath the canopy, waiting for the weight to press down once more upon the world of the living. Because the canopy was patient. The canopy was eternal, and the canopy would always be hungry. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.